There are places in the desert where the ground reflects light it should not be able to hold. The Kofa National Wildlife Refuge covers more than 660,000 acres in southwestern Arizona, pressed between the Yuma Desert and the Sonoran borderlands. It is named for the King of Arizona Mine, a gold operation that ran intermittently from 1896 until the ore played out in the 1920s. What remains is a landscape of volcanic peaks, dry washes, and creosote flats where summer temperatures routinely exceed 115 degrees. The refuge was established in 1939 to protect desert bighorn sheep, though the terrain also shelters populations of desert tortoises, kit foxes, and Gila monsters. Fewer than 30,000 people visit each year. Most stay on the maintained roads. The backcountry is roadless, waterless, and largely unmonitored. The refuge headquarters sits near the northern boundary, staffed by 3 rangers who rotate shifts and conduct periodic surveys of the more accessible areas. Beyond the mapped trails, the Kofa Mountains rise in jagged ridges of dark volcanic rock, broken by steep canyons where palm trees grow in hidden springs. Spanish explorers passed through in the 1700s. Prospectors came later, leaving behind rusted equipment and claims that were abandoned when the gold ran out. The land was surveyed multiple times during the territorial period, but much of the interior remains difficult to reach and rarely visited. In October of 2001, a wildlife biologist named Dr. Marcus Delgado was conducting a population survey of desert bighorn sheep in the southern section of the refuge. He was working alone, as was standard for such surveys, traveling on foot through a region of low hills and alluvial plains approximately 15 miles from the nearest road. The work required patience. Hours spent glassing distant ridges with binoculars, documenting sightings, and noting signs of movement or feeding. On the afternoon of October 9th, Delgado was moving through a shallow basin when he noticed something unusual on the ground ahead. A patch of sand, maybe 3 feet in diameter, that appeared to be reflecting sunlight with unusual intensity. He approached cautiously, assuming at first that it might be a piece of discarded metal or glass left by prospectors decades earlier. It was neither. The patch was sand, ordinary desert sand, the same pale gray and tan mixture that covered the rest of the basin. But its surface gleamed like polished metal, throwing back sunlight in a way that made it difficult to look at directly. Delgado crouched beside it. The sand felt warm, noticeably warmer than the surrounding ground, though the basin was in full sun and the ambient temperature was already 94 degrees. He touched the surface. It felt like sand, granular, loose, shifting under pressure, but it reflected his hand like a mirror. He stood and scanned the area. 6 more patches were visible within 50 yards, all identical in size and appearance, all arranged in a rough circle around the first. 7 patches total. Delgado photographed them with a digital camera he carried for documenting wildlife. He took notes on their size, spacing, and appearance. He collected a small sample from one of the patches, placing it in a plastic bag. Then he marked the location on his GPS unit and continued his survey. When he returned to the refuge headquarters 3 days later, he mentioned the patches to the refuge manager, a man named Stephen Kowalski. Kowalski had worked at Kofa for 12 years and had never heard of anything similar. He suggested Delgado submit the sample to the geology department at the University of Arizona for analysis. Delgado did. The sample was examined by a graduate student named Lisa Feinberg, who ran it through standard tests for mineral content, particle size, and optical properties. Her report, filed in November of 2001, concluded that the sample was consistent with typical desert sand from the region, primarily quartz and feldspar with trace amounts of mica and iron oxide. There was nothing unusual about its composition. No foreign materials, no unusual coatings, no explanation for the reflective properties Delgado had observed. Feinberg suggested the reflection might have been caused by moisture or a temporary alignment of mineral grains. She noted that certain conditions, dew, condensation, or specific angles of light, could produce unusual optical effects in sand. Delgado disagreed. The patches had been dry. The effect had been consistent across multiple observations and remained visible for the entire time he had been in the basin. In the spring of 2002, Delgado returned to the site with a colleague, a field technician named Roger Baptiste. They brought additional equipment, soil thermometers, reflectance meters, and sample containers. They hiked to the coordinates Delgado had marked. The patches were gone. The basin looked no different than any other stretch of desert: sand, scattered rocks, creosote bushes. Delgado checked his GPS unit 3 times. The coordinates were correct. They searched the surrounding area for 2 hours. They found nothing. Baptiste suggested they might have misidentified the location. Delgado was certain they had not. The basin had distinct features: a collapsed arroyo on the western edge, a line of saguaros on a low ridge to the north. It was the right place. The patches simply were not there. They left without taking samples. Over the next year, reports of similar patches began appearing in the refuge's incident logs. In June of 2002, a group of hikers reported seeing shiny spots on the ground near Palm Canyon, approximately 20 miles north of where Delgado had made his observations. They described the spots as circular, reflective, and warm to the touch. They photographed them with a disposable camera, but the images, when developed, showed only ordinary sand. In November of 2002, a volunteer ranger conducting a trail survey in the Signal Peak area noted 7 circular areas of reflective sand in a wash near the base of the peak. She marked the location but did not collect samples. When a ranger returned to the site 2 weeks later, the patches were no longer visible. In March of 2003, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service authorized a formal investigation. A team of 3 geologists from the Arizona Geological Survey was dispatched to the refuge with instructions to locate and document any unusual sand formations. The team spent 5 days surveying areas where patches had been reported. They used ground-penetrating radar, infrared imaging, and soil sampling equipment. They found nothing conclusive. Their report, completed in April of 2003, acknowledged that multiple credible witnesses have reported observing reflective sand patches in various locations within the refuge, but stated that no such formations were present during the survey period. The report suggested the phenomenon might be seasonal or dependent on specific environmental conditions that were not present at the time of the investigation. The lead geologist, Dr. Alan Pritchard, was more direct in his private notes. In an email to a colleague, later obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, he wrote, "We found evidence of recent disturbance in 3 of the reported areas: shallow depressions, slight discoloration, higher surface temperatures. Something was there, but by the time we arrived, it was gone, or it stopped." No further investigations were authorized. The case was closed in May of 2003 and filed under Unexplained Geological Phenomena, a designation that requires no follow-up, but the patches continued to appear. In 2006, a photographer documenting desert wildflowers stumbled across a cluster of 7 reflective patches near New Water Mountains, 15 miles east of the refuge boundary. He spent an hour photographing them from multiple angles. When he returned the following day, with better equipment, the patches had vanished. His photographs showed only sand. In 2009, a geology professor from Northern Arizona University, Dr. Helena Varga, read about the phenomenon in an obscure field report and decided to investigate independently. She hiked into the refuge in January when temperatures were cooler and conditions more stable. She carried spectrographic equipment, hoping to analyze the light reflected from the patches if she found them. She did not. But in the area where Delgado had made his original observation, she recorded surface temperatures 4 degrees higher than the surrounding terrain. An anomaly with no apparent cause. The readings were consistent across a circular area approximately 3 feet in diameter. She took soil samples. Analysis showed nothing unusual. Varga submitted a paper to a geology journal describing her findings. It was rejected. The reviewers noted that without direct observation of the reflective phenomenon, the elevated temperatures could be attributed to numerous natural factors: buried rock, differences in sand density, microbial activity. She did not resubmit. The most recent report came in January of 2018. A solo hiker, whose name was not recorded in the refuge logs, left a note at the visitor center describing 7 circles of glass-like sand he had encountered near Castle Dome Peak. He included coordinates. A ranger visited the site 3 days later and found nothing unusual. The hiker did not return to claim his note. Attempts to contact him using the phone number he provided were unsuccessful. The number was no longer in service. The patches appear without warning. They vanish without explanation. They are always warm, they are always reflective, and they are always 7 in number. Geologists cannot explain them. Rangers no longer investigate them. And the desert keeps producing them, in places where no one is watching, at times when no one is there to see. Some patterns are too perfect to be accidents. The Painted Desert stretches across northern Arizona, a badlands of layered sediment and mineral deposits that shift in color with the angle of the sun. The landscape is ancient, 225 million years, compressed into bands of red, purple, and gray stone. It is not a single desert, but a region, spanning roughly 160 miles from the Grand Canyon eastward into the petrified forest. The Navajo and Hopi have lived at its edges for centuries. Spanish explorers passed through in the 1500s and found nothing worth claiming. By the time the United States surveyed the territory in the 1800s, the Painted Desert was noted primarily for its inhospitality. No water, no timber, no arable land. The terrain discourages passage. Much of it remains roadless. What trails exist are unmarked and shift with the wind. Erosion works constantly, carving hoodoos and arroyos that appear and vanish within a generation. The Bureau of Land Management oversees vast sections of it, though oversight is limited to occasional flyovers and boundary maintenance. Few people venture into the backcountry. Those who do tend to stay on established routes. In the spring of 1993, a contract pilot named Michael Garrett was conducting an aerial survey for the BLM, photographing sections of the desert for updated topographical records. It was routine work, hours of flying in slow grids, a camera mounted to the fuselage, the ground passing beneath in shades of rust and bone. On April 14th, Garrett was flying over a section of the desert approximately 30 miles southeast of Tuba City, near the boundary between Navajo and Apache counties. The area was unmapped in detail, designated only as open range with no known archaeological sites. Garrett had flown the same route 3 times that week. On his 4th pass, he noticed something in the landscape that had not registered before. A pattern. From the air, it was unmistakable. A grid of shallow depressions etched into the desert floor, extending in straight lines across the hard pan. Each depression was roughly circular, maybe 10 feet in diameter, and spaced at regular intervals. Garrett altered his flight path and made 2 additional passes, descending to 800 feet. The grid covered approximately 12 square miles. The depressions were faint, visible only because of the way shadows pooled in them during the late afternoon light. Garrett took 16 photographs. He marked the coordinates and filed his report with the BLM office in Flagstaff. 2 weeks later, a survey team was dispatched to the site. The team consisted of 3 BLM field agents and a contract archaeologist named Dr. Evelyn Mora, brought in to assess whether the depressions might be of cultural significance. They accessed the area by truck, following dry washes and cattle trails until the terrain became impassable, then continued on foot. The depressions were there, hundreds of them, possibly thousands, stretching in every direction across the flat desert pan. Each was shallow, no more than 6 inches deep, and weathered smooth as though worn by water or wind over a long period. But it was the spacing that unsettled the team. The depressions were arranged in a perfect grid, each one exactly 47 feet from the next, measured center to center. The rows ran north to south. The columns ran east to west. The precision was absolute. Dr. Mora spent 2 days at the site, taking measurements and soil samples. She found no artifacts, no pottery shards, no stone tools. The depressions contained no organic material, no charcoal, no evidence of fire or habitation. The surrounding soil was undisturbed. She examined the area for signs of agricultural terracing, ancestral Puebloan construction, or livestock corrals. She found none. In her preliminary report, Mora wrote, "The uniformity of spacing suggests intentional design, but the absence of any cultural material makes attribution impossible. The depressions do not correspond to any known indigenous land use pattern in the region. Natural erosion does not produce geometric regularity at this scale." She recommended further study. The BLM scheduled a follow-up survey for June. Before the second survey could take place, the site was reclassified. On May 28, 1993, the BLM issued an internal memo stating that the area in question had been redesignated as culturally sensitive and placed under restricted access pending consultation with tribal authorities. The June survey was canceled. Dr. Mora was informed that her services were no longer required. She was not told why. Michael Garrett, the pilot who discovered the grid, mentioned the site to a colleague, a retired Air Force navigator named Harold Pitts, who had flown reconnaissance missions over Nevada in the 1960s. Pitts had seen similar patterns before, though he could not recall where. He suggested Garrett file a Freedom of Information Act request for any military survey data covering that section of Arizona. Garrett submitted the request in July of 1993. It was denied. The response cited exemptions related to ongoing federal land management operations. In October of 1993, a journalist from the Navajo Times visited the site after hearing about the discovery from a BLM clerk who had processed Garrett's flight logs. The journalist, a man named Thomas Yellowhorse, hiked into the area with a GPS unit and a camera. He found the depressions, though they were already beginning to fade. Wind had filled some with sand. Others had been scoured by runoff from a recent storm. He photographed what remained and interviewed a local rancher who grazed cattle in the area. The rancher, who asked not to be named, said he had seen the depressions before. He said they had been there as long as he could remember, maybe 20 years, maybe longer. He said his father had mentioned them once, describing them as old survey marks, though from what survey he did not know. The rancher also said that cattle avoided the area. Not aggressively. They simply moved around it, grazing elsewhere even when forage was sparse. Yellowhorse's article appeared in the Navajo Times in November of 1993. It was brief, fewer than 600 words, and ran without a photograph. The images he had taken were lost, he later claimed, when his camera was stolen from his vehicle in Flagstaff. He never returned to the site. Dr. Mora attempted to access the area again in January of 1994. She was denied entry by a BLM ranger who informed her that the site had been closed for environmental restoration. When she asked what was being restored, the ranger did not have an answer. In March of 1994, a second aerial survey was conducted by a different contract pilot. The pilot's name does not appear in public records, and the photographs from that flight were never released. According to a BLM internal document obtained years later through a FOIA request, The survey found no significant topographical anomalies in the area previously identified by Garrett. By 1995, the grid was gone. Not obscured, gone. A group of geology students from Northern Arizona University hiked to the coordinates in the fall of that year as part of a class project on desert geomorphology. They found only wind-scoured hardpan indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape. They took core samples. The soil layers showed no evidence of disturbance, no compaction, no depressions. It was as though the grid had never existed, but the measurements remained. Garrett's flight logs were precise. The coordinates he recorded matched the location Dr. Mora surveyed. The 47-foot spacing was documented in her field notes. The photographs existed, 16 of them, stored in the BLM archive in Flagstaff. In 2007, a researcher attempting to access those photographs for a study on desert erosion patterns was informed that the images had been misfiled and could not be located. They were never found. In 2012, satellite imagery of the region became publicly available through commercial services. A retired cartographer named Susan Oakes, working on a personal project mapping unmarked trails in the Painted Desert, noticed something unusual in archival satellite images from 1992. Faint linear shadows, visible only in high-resolution files, crisscrossed the same area Garrett had photographed. The shadows formed a grid. Oakes measured the spacing using geographic information software. The intervals were consistent, 47 feet. She contacted the BLM. They had no record of the site. She contacted Dr. Mora, who had since retired and moved to New Mexico. Mora confirmed the discovery, but declined to comment further. In a more Worstier email, she wrote only, "I documented what I saw. I reported what I found. I was told to stop asking questions." Oakes submitted her findings to a journal specializing in archaeological remote sensing. The paper was rejected. The reviewers noted that without ground verification or supporting material evidence, the satellite data was insufficient to confirm human construction. They suggested the patterns might be artifacts of image compression or atmospheric distortion. Oakes did not pursue publication elsewhere. The area remains open to the public, though it is difficult to reach and rarely visited. There are no trails, no markers, no indication that anything unusual was ever recorded there. The BLM maintains no restricted zones in that section of the desert. Tribal authorities have no record of cultural sites at those coordinates. But the grid existed. It was seen, measured, and photographed. And then it was erased, not by time, but by something more deliberate. The 47-foot intervals remain unexplained. The precision remains unexplained. And the absence, perhaps, is the most troubling detail of all. There are places in the desert where the ground reflects light it should not be able to hold. The Kofa National Wildlife Refuge covers more than 660,000 acres in southwestern Arizona, pressed between the Yuma Desert and the Sonoran borderlands. It is named for the King of Arizona Mine, a gold operation that ran intermittently from 1896 until the ore played out in the 1920s. What remains is a landscape of volcanic peaks, dry washes, and creosote flats where summer temperatures routinely exceed 115 degrees. The refuge was established in 1939 to protect desert bighorn sheep, though the terrain also shelters populations of desert tortoises, kit foxes, and Gila monsters. Fewer than 30,000 people visit each year. Most stay on the maintained roads. The backcountry is roadless, waterless, and largely unmonitored. The refuge headquarters sits near the northern boundary, staffed by 3 rangers who rotate shifts and conduct periodic surveys of the more accessible areas. Beyond the mapped trails, the Kofa Mountains rise in jagged ridges of dark volcanic rock, broken by steep canyons where palm trees grow in hidden springs. Spanish explorers passed through in the 1700s. Prospectors came later, leaving behind rusted equipment and claims that were abandoned when the gold ran out. The land was surveyed multiple times during the territorial period, but much of the interior remains difficult to reach and rarely visited. In October of 2001, a wildlife biologist named Dr. Marcus Delgado was conducting a population survey of desert bighorn sheep in the southern section of the refuge. He was working alone, as was standard for such surveys, traveling on foot through a region of low hills and alluvial plains approximately 15 miles from the nearest road. The work required patience. Hours spent glassing distant ridges with binoculars, documenting sightings, and noting signs of movement or feeding. On the afternoon of October 9th, Delgado was moving through a shallow basin when he noticed something unusual on the ground ahead. A patch of sand, maybe 3 feet in diameter, that appeared to be reflecting sunlight with unusual intensity. He approached cautiously, assuming at first that it might be a piece of discarded metal or glass left by prospectors decades earlier. It was neither. The patch was sand, ordinary desert sand, the same pale gray and tan mixture that covered the rest of the basin. But its surface gleamed like polished metal, throwing back sunlight in a way that made it difficult to look at directly. Delgado crouched beside it. The sand felt warm, noticeably warmer than the surrounding ground, though the basin was in full sun and the ambient temperature was already 94 degrees. He touched the surface. It felt like sand, granular, loose, shifting under pressure, but it reflected his hand like a mirror. He stood and scanned the area. 6 more patches were visible within 50 yards, all identical in size and appearance, all arranged in a rough circle around the first. 7 patches total. Delgado photographed them with a digital camera he carried for documenting wildlife. He took notes on their size, spacing, and appearance. He collected a small sample from one of the patches, placing it in a plastic bag. Then he marked the location on his GPS unit and continued his survey. When he returned to the refuge headquarters 3 days later, he mentioned the patches to the refuge manager, a man named Stephen Kowalski. Kowalski had worked at COFA for 12 years and had never heard of anything similar. He suggested Delgado submit the sample to the geology department at the University of Arizona for analysis. Delgado did. The sample was examined by a graduate student named Lisa Feinberg, who ran it through standard tests for mineral content, particle size, and optical properties. Her report, filed in November of 2001, concluded that the sample was consistent with typical desert sand from the region, primarily quartz and feldspar with trace amounts of mica and iron oxide. There was nothing unusual about its composition. No foreign materials, no unusual coatings, no explanation for the reflective properties Delgado had observed. Feinberg suggested the reflection might have been caused by moisture or a temporary alignment of mineral grains. She noted that certain conditions, dew, condensation, or specific angles of light, could produce unusual optical effects in sand. Delgado disagreed. The patches had been dry. The effect had been consistent across multiple observations and remained visible for the entire time he had been in the basin. In the spring of 2002, Delgado returned to the site with a colleague, a field technician named Roger Baptiste. They brought additional equipment, soil thermometers, reflectance meters, and sample containers. They hiked to the coordinates Delgado had marked. The patches were gone. The basin looked no different than any other stretch of desert: sand, scattered rocks, creosote bushes. Delgado checked his GPS unit 3 times. The coordinates were correct. They searched the surrounding area for 2 hours. They found nothing. Baptiste suggested they might have misidentified the location. Delgado was certain they had not. The basin had distinct features: a collapsed arroyo on the western edge, a line of saguaros on a low ridge to the north. It was the right place. The patches simply were not there. They left without taking samples. Over the next year, reports of similar patches began appearing in the refuge's incident logs. In June of 2002, a group of hikers reported seeing shiny spots on the ground near Palm Canyon, approximately 20 miles north of where Delgado had made his observations. They described the spots as circular, reflective, and warm to the touch. They photographed them with a disposable camera, but the images, when developed, showed only ordinary sand. In November of 2002, a volunteer ranger conducting a trail survey in the Signal Peak area noted 7 circular areas of reflective sand in a wash near the base of the peak. She marked the location but did not collect samples. When a ranger returned to the site 2 weeks later, the patches were no longer visible. In March of 2003, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service authorized a formal investigation. A team of 3 geologists from the Arizona Geological Survey was dispatched to the refuge with instructions to locate and document any unusual sand formations. The team spent 5 days surveying areas where patches had been reported. They used ground-penetrating radar, infrared imaging, and soil sampling equipment. They found nothing conclusive. Their report, completed in April of 2003, acknowledged that multiple credible witnesses have reported observing reflective sand patches in various locations within the refuge, but stated that no such formations were present during the survey period. The report suggested the phenomenon might be seasonal or dependent on specific environmental conditions that were not present at the time of the investigation. The lead geologist, Dr. Alan Pritchard, was more direct in his private notes. In an email to a colleague, later obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, he wrote, "We found evidence of recent disturbance in 3 of the reported areas: shallow depressions, slight discoloration, higher surface temperatures. Something was there, but by the time we arrived, it was gone, or it stopped." No further investigations were authorized. The case was closed in May of 2003 and filed under Unexplained Geological Phenomena, a designation that requires no follow-up, but the patches continued to appear. In 2006, a photographer documenting desert wildflowers stumbled across a cluster of 7 reflective patches near New Water Mountains, 15 miles east of the refuge boundary. He spent an hour photographing them from multiple angles. When he returned the following day, with better equipment, the patches had vanished. His photographs showed only sand. In 2009, a geology professor from Northern Arizona University, Dr. Helena Varga, read about the phenomenon in an obscure field report and decided to investigate independently. She hiked into the refuge in January when temperatures were cooler and conditions more stable. She carried spectrographic equipment, hoping to analyze the light reflected from the patches if she found them. She did not. But in the area where Delgado had made his original observation, she recorded surface temperatures 4 degrees higher than the surrounding terrain. An anomaly with no apparent cause. The readings were consistent across a circular area approximately 3 feet in diameter. She took soil samples. Analysis showed nothing unusual. Varga submitted a paper to a geology journal describing her findings. It was rejected. The reviewers noted that without direct observation of the reflective phenomenon, the elevated temperatures could be attributed to numerous natural factors: buried rock, differences in sand density, microbial activity. She did not resubmit. The most recent report came in January of 2018. A solo hiker, whose name was not recorded in the refuge logs, left a note at the visitor center describing 7 circles of glass-like sand he had encountered near Castle Dome Peak. He included coordinates. A ranger visited the site 3 days later and found nothing unusual. The hiker did not return to claim his note. Attempts to contact him using the phone number he provided were unsuccessful. The number was no longer in service. The patches appear without warning. They vanish without explanation. They are always warm, they are always reflective, and they are always 7 in number. Geologists cannot explain them. Rangers no longer investigate them. and the desert keeps producing them, in places where no one is watching, at times when no one is there to see. Some numbers refuse to change, no matter how many times you count. Quartzsite sits in the low desert of western Arizona, 11 miles from the California border, in a basin surrounded by the Plumosa and Dome Rock Mountains. The town exists primarily as a waypoint. Interstate 10 runs through it, connecting Phoenix to Los Angeles. For most of the year, Quartzsite's population hovers around 3,000. In winter, that number swells to over 1 million as retirees and recreational vehicles converge for gem shows, swap meets, and the simple appeal of cheap Bureau of Land Management land, where they can park for months without paying rent. The surrounding desert is public land, open to anyone, marked by dirt roads that lead nowhere, and acres of creosote, palo verde, and stone. The La Posa long-term visitor area lies just south of town, a sprawling zone of BLM land designated for extended camping. It is flat, featureless, and unremarkable, the kind of landscape that exists primarily to be passed through. But 8 miles west of the main camping zones, beyond the last maintained road, there is a valley that runs north to south between two low ridges. It has no official name. Topographic maps label it only by elevation. Locals, when they refer to it at all, call it the Dry Wash, though no significant wash runs through it. In the fall of 2001, a team from the Arizona Game and Fish Department began a multi-year study on desert tortoise populations in the region. The study required systematic surveys, walking predetermined transects, counting individual tortoises, and recording their locations with handheld GPS units. The work was tedious and slow, conducted during the cooler months when tortoises were most active. The team leader was a wildlife biologist named Dr. Janet Kosiara. She had worked in desert environments for 15 years and had conducted similar surveys across Nevada, Utah, and California. The Quartzsite survey was expected to be straightforward, baseline data collection with predictable results. On November 7, 2001, Kosiara and 2 field technicians, David Huang and Maria Sepulveda, were conducting a transect through the unnamed valley west of the La Posa area. Each carried a digital counter, a simple handheld device used to tally observations. The devices were standard equipment, battery-powered, with a mechanical button that incremented a display each time it was pressed. By mid-morning, the team had counted 18 tortoises. Kosiara glanced at her counter to confirm the number. The display read 197,433. She assumed the device had malfunctioned. She reset it. The number returned immediately, 197,433. She called to Huang and Sepulveda. They checked their own counters. Both displayed the same number. The team stopped the survey and returned to their truck, parked at the valley's entrance. Once outside the valley, the counters resumed normal function. Kosiara tested hers repeatedly, pressing the button, watching the count increment from 0, 1, 2, 3. It worked perfectly. They returned to the valley. Within minutes, all 3 counters locked again at 197,433. Kosiara documented the incident in her field notes. She mentioned it to her supervisor, who suggested the devices might have been exposed to electromagnetic interference, perhaps from underground mineral deposits or radio transmissions. Kosiara was skeptical but agreed to test the theory. 2 weeks later, she returned to the valley with new equipment, different counters, fresh batteries, and a portable RF detector to measure electromagnetic fields. The results were identical. The counters malfunctioned within minutes of entering the valley, always displaying the same number. The RF detector showed no unusual activity. Background radiation levels were normal. Then Kosiara noticed something else. Her wristwatch had stopped. Not broken. Stopped. The second hand no longer moved. The digital display on her GPS unit was frozen. Even the odometer in her truck, when she drove partway into the valley, ceased advancing. Every device capable of counting or measuring incremental change locked at 197,433. Devices without numerical displays, radios, compasses, thermometers, functioned normally. The effect was specific and consistent. Kosiara spent 3 days testing the phenomenon. She brought mechanical counters, spring-loaded devices with no batteries or electronics. They worked. She brought a laptop computer. Its clock froze. She brought a film camera with a frame counter. The counter stopped advancing after displaying the same 6-digit figure. She collected soil samples, checked for metal debris, and examined the area for abandoned infrastructure. She found nothing. The valley was empty. No buildings, no equipment, no buried cables. Just sand, rock, and desert scrub. In her final report to Arizona Game and Fish, Kosiara described the anomaly in measured terms. She noted that electronic counting devices malfunction in a specific geographic area for reasons that remain unexplained. She recommended the valley be excluded from future survey grids until the cause could be determined. The report generated little interest. Wildlife surveys were not a priority, and equipment malfunctions were common in desert fieldwork. No follow-up investigation was authorized. But Kosiara was not the only person to notice the valley's effects. In March of 2002, a retired engineer named Gordon Phelps was exploring BLM land in his RV when he drove into the valley. His GPS unit froze. His dashboard clock stopped. He exited the vehicle to check for mechanical problems and noticed his digital watch had also stopped. When he drove back out of the valley, everything resumed normal. Function. Phelps was a methodical man. He spent the next 2 days testing the phenomenon, using equipment from his RV, a handheld calculator, a digital thermometer, a battery tester. Every device with a numerical display froze at the same number when brought into the valley. He wrote a letter to the Bureau of Land Management describing what he had observed. He received a form response thanking him for his interest in public lands. No one from the BLM contacted him. In January of 2003, a group of amateur radio operators set up a temporary station near Quartzsite for a winter field event. One of the operators, a man named Lawrence Teague, hiked into the valley to test signal propagation from an elevated position. His radio worked, but the frequency counter on his transceiver locked at 197,433 kilohertz, a frequency far outside the amateur bands. Teague assumed the device was broken. He replaced it with a backup unit. The same thing happened. Teague mentioned the incident to other operators at the event. 2 of them hiked into the valley to verify his claims. Their equipment behaved identically. One operator, a retired electrical engineer, brought an oscilloscope. It functioned normally until he activated its digital frequency readout. The display froze at the same 6-digit figure. The operators discussed the phenomenon on an online forum dedicated to field radio operations. The thread received over 100 replies before it was removed by a moderator. Several users reported similar experiences in the same valley. Others suggested explanations: buried power lines, military testing, geomagnetic anomalies. None of the theories were tested. In the summer of 2003, a geology graduate student from the University of Arizona named Philip Arnett read about the valley in a blog post and decided to investigate. He was studying for a thesis on desert geomorphology and thought the anomaly might be related to subsurface mineral deposits or fault line activity. Arnett spent a week in the valley conducting ground-penetrating radar surveys and magnetic field measurements. He found no unusual geological features, no metallic deposits, no voids, no water. The radar showed only sediment and bedrock, standard desert stratigraphy. But his equipment malfunctioned just as Kosiara's had. Digital displays froze. Counters locked. Even the timestamp on his radar data files became corrupted, showing the same 6-digit number embedded in the metadata. Arnett submitted his findings as part of his thesis. His advisor recommended removing the section on the valley, describing it as anecdotal and unverifiable. Arnett complied. He received his degree in 2004 and left Arizona for a job in private industry. He did not return to the valley. By 2005, the reports had stopped. No new incidents were documented. The valley remained public land, accessible to anyone. But fewer people visited. Those who did rarely stayed long. In 2010, a journalist named Rebecca Torres, working on a story about desert recreation, interviewed several long-term RV residents in Quartzsite. One of them mentioned the valley. He said people avoided it, not because of the equipment malfunctions, most had never experienced them, but because the place felt wrong, quiet in a way that was not peaceful, empty in a way that suggested something had been removed. Torres visited the valley. Her voice recorder functioned normally. Her camera worked. But her smartphone's clock stopped the moment she crossed into the area. When she left, it resumed, displaying the correct time as though no interruption had occurred. She included a brief mention of the valley in her article published in a regional outdoor magazine. The reference was vague, 2 sentences describing a remote area where electronic devices behave unpredictably. She did not provide coordinates. No official investigation has ever been conducted. The Bureau of Land Management maintains no records of the anomaly. Arizona Game and Fish excluded the valley from subsequent surveys, citing logistical constraints. The number, 197,433, appears nowhere in public records, military documents, or academic literature. But it is there, waiting, in every device brought into the valley, in every counter, every clock, every display capable of showing numbers, the same 6 digits repeating endlessly as though counting something no one can see. There are places where the basic rules stop applying, and no one can explain why. The Superstition Mountains rise abruptly from the Sonoran Desert 40 miles east of Phoenix, a volcanic massif of cliffs, canyons, and maze-like ridges that have resisted easy passage since the Apache controlled the region. The range covers roughly 160,000 acres, most of it protected as wilderness. The peaks are named for the legends that accumulated around them, stories of lost gold mines, vanished prospectors, and Apache curses meant to keep outsiders away. Spanish explorers noted the range in the 1600s, but did not stay. Anglo prospectors arrived in the 1800s, drawn by rumors of ore. Many never returned. By the early 20th century, the Superstitions had earned a reputation as a place where people disappeared without explanation. The terrain is hostile. Summer temperatures exceed 110 degrees. Winter nights drop below freezing. Water is scarce. Trails are poorly marked and often end abruptly at cliff edges or impassable boulder fields. The Forest Service maintains a handful of marked routes, but much of the interior remains unmapped in detail. Hikers are warned not to venture off established paths. Search and rescue operations are frequent. Bodies are sometimes recovered years after a person goes missing, often miles from where they were last seen. In March of 1979, a group of 6 geology students from Arizona State University entered the Superstition Wilderness as part of a field course on geomagnetic surveying. The course instructor, Dr. Peter Wyckoff, had secured a permit to conduct research in an area near Weaver's Needle, a volcanic spire that serves as a landmark visible from much of the range. The students were tasked with mapping magnetic field variations across a grid, using handheld magnetometers and compasses to record data at predetermined intervals. On March 14th, 2 of the students, Robert Lindstrom and Angela Moretti, were working along the northern edge of their assigned grid when Lindstrom noticed his compass behaving erratically. The needle was spinning, not seeking north but rotating continuously in a counterclockwise direction. He called Moretti over. Her compass did the same. They marked the spot and expanded their survey, moving in widening circles. Within an hour, they had identified a roughly circular area, approximately 200 feet in diameter, where every compass they carried spun counterclockwise. The rotation was smooth and constant, completing one full revolution every 12 seconds. Lindstrom and Moretti returned to the base camp and reported the anomaly to Dr. Wyckoff. The following day, the entire group hiked to the site. Wyckoff brought additional equipment, a proton magnetometer, a portable gravity meter, and a geologic compass mounted on a tripod for stability. All of the compasses behaved identically, spinning counterclockwise within the defined area and functioning normally outside it. The magnetometer recorded fluctuations consistent with localized magnetic interference, but the readings were inconsistent, spiking and dropping without pattern. Then Moretti noticed the plants. The area was dominated by ocotillo, prickly pear, and scattered patches of brittlebush. But within the compass anomaly zone, the plant growth was different. The ocotillo branches spiraled as they grew, not the gentle curves typical of desert flora seeking sunlight, but tight helical twists that coiled counterclockwise, opposite the direction most plants naturally turn. The prickly pear pads grew in whorls that curved inward rather than outward. Even the brittlebush stems showed signs of reverse spiraling, though less pronounced. Wyckoff photographed the plants extensively. He took samples, and then, as an experiment, he poured water from his canteen onto the ground. The water moved upward, not as a spray or mist. It flowed as a liquid, defying gravity for approximately 3 seconds before falling back and soaking into the soil. The effect was subtle but unmistakable. Wyckoff repeated the test 6 times, each time with the same result. Water poured within the anomaly zone would rise briefly, a few inches above the point of impact, before gravity reasserted itself. The students spent 2 more days at the site, documenting everything they could. They measured the exact boundaries of the anomaly using a measuring tape and compass bearings. They recorded the coordinates with a transit and topographic map. They collected soil samples, rock samples, and plant specimens. Wyckoff wrote detailed field notes, including sketches of the spiral plant growth and descriptions of the water behavior. He marked the site with a cairn, a stack of stones 4 feet high, clearly visible from a distance. When the group returned to the university, Wyckoff submitted his findings to the Department of Geosciences. He proposed a follow-up expedition with more sophisticated equipment, including ground-penetrating radar and a cesium vapor magnetometer. His proposal was approved. The expedition was scheduled for November of 1979. Wyckoff returned to the Superstitions with 3 colleagues and 2 graduate assistants. They carried GPS units, new technology at the time, bulky but precise. They had Wyckoff's original field notes, his photographs, and his hand-drawn maps. They hiked to the coordinates he had recorded. The cairn was gone, and the anomaly could not be found. The team spent 4 days searching. They used the GPS coordinates. They triangulated from Weaver's Needle and other landmarks Wyckoff had noted. They walked grid patterns across an area of several square miles. They found nothing. Compasses functioned normally. Plants grew in ordinary patterns. Water poured on the ground, behaved as water should. One of the graduate assistants, a woman named Diane Furtado, suggested they might be searching in the wrong location. She noted that the GPS coordinates placed them approximately half a mile south of where Wyckoff's original map indicated the site should be. Wyckoff insisted the map was accurate. They searched both locations. Neither showed any signs of the anomaly. In his final report, Wyckoff wrote, Despite extensive effort, we were unable to relocate the magnetic anomaly observed in March. The coordinates derived from our original survey do not correspond to any site displaying the previously documented characteristics. It is possible that the phenomenon was temporary or that an error occurred in our initial positioning. But Wyckoff did not believe there had been an error. In a letter to a colleague, later found in his personal files after his death in 2008, he wrote, "I know what we saw. I know where we were. The site existed, and then it didn't. I have no explanation for that." Robert Lindstrom, one of the original students, kept a personal journal of the expedition. In an entry dated November 18, 1979, he wrote, "We found the area where the cairn should have been. There were stones scattered on the ground, not stacked, just lying there like they'd always been part of the landscape. Dr. Wyckoff didn't say anything, but I could tell he recognized them. Someone, or something, had taken the cairn apart, but there were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there." Angela Moretti, the other student who initially discovered the anomaly, was interviewed in 2012 by a researcher compiling oral histories of unusual geological phenomena. She described the site in detail, the spinning compasses, the spiraling plants, the water flowing upward. When asked if she thought the site still existed, she said, "I think it's still there, just not where we can find it. Or not when we can find it. I don't know which is more disturbing." No subsequent expeditions have reported similar findings in the Superstition Mountains. Geomagnetic surveys conducted in the 1980s and 90s detected no unusual anomalies in the area Wyckoff described. The Forest Service has no record of the cairn or of any restricted areas matching the location, but the photographs remain. Wyckoff's images show the spiraling ocotillo branches, the curved, prickly pear pads, the desert floor where water once moved against gravity. The images are stored in the Arizona State University Geology Department archive, filed under Field Study Documentation, 1979. And the coordinates remain in Wyckoff's field notes, written in his careful hand. 33 degrees, 28 minutes, 42 seconds north, 111 degrees, 26 minutes, 18 seconds west. The site should be there, but it is not. In 2016, a hiker named Samuel Ruiz reported finding an area in the Superstitions where his compass acted strange. He did not elaborate in his report to the Forest Service, and, when contacted for follow-up, he declined to provide specific details or coordinates. He said only that he had not stayed long and had no intention of returning. The Superstition Mountains remain open to hikers and researchers. Thousands visit each year. Most follow the marked trails. Some venture deeper into areas where maps are unreliable and landmarks shift with the seasons. And somewhere in that maze of stone and desert scrub, there may still be a place where compasses spin backward, where plants grow in spirals that defy biology, and where water forgets, for just a moment, which way it is supposed to fall. Some sounds carry across the desert that have no source and no explanation. Salome is a small, unincorporated community in western Arizona, roughly 60 miles west of Phoenix along U.S. Route 60. The town exists primarily as a rest stop, a handful of gas stations, a diner, a motel, and scattered mobile homes spread across flat desert scrub. The population has never exceeded 900. Most residents are retirees drawn by cheap land and isolation. The surrounding terrain is typical Sonoran desert, creosote, cholla cactus, and gravel flats that stretch unbroken to low mountain ranges on every horizon. There is nothing remarkable about Salome. It is a place people pass through on their way to somewhere else. The town was named in 1904 by a developer who hoped to attract settlers with biblical references, though the town never grew beyond a few structures clustered along the highway. A post office opened in 1907 and closed in 1953. By the 1980s, Salome consisted mainly of a trailer park, a small general store, and a volunteer fire department. The nearest sheriff's substation was in Wendon, 12 miles north. The nearest hospital was in Wickenburg, 40 miles east. For practical purposes, Salome was on its own. In June of 1998, several residents began reporting an unusual sound occurring at night, a kind of singing, they said, though unlike anything they had heard before. The reports were initially dismissed as highway noise or distant radio broadcasts carried on desert thermals. But the accounts persisted, and they were consistent. The first documented report came from a woman named Dorothy Schaefer, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in Salome since 1986. On the night of June 12th, Schaefer called the La Paz County Sheriff's Office to report what she described as people singing somewhere out in the desert. The dispatcher asked if she could see anyone. She said no. The dispatcher asked if it might be a radio. She said it was not coming from a radio. It was coming from outside, from the open desert west of town. The dispatcher logged the call but did not send a deputy. 3 nights later, on June 15th, a man named Victor Ruiz called the same number. He reported hearing singing, like a church choir, he said, drifting across the desert from the south. He had gone outside to investigate, but found nothing. The sound continued for approximately 20 minutes, then stopped. He could not determine a direction or distance. It simply surrounded him, as though coming from everywhere at once. By the end of June, at least 12 residents had reported similar experiences. The singing occurred only at night, always after 10 p.m., and always on nights with no wind. It lasted between 15 and 30 minutes. Witnesses described it as choral, multiple voices, harmonizing, but singing in a language no one recognized. Some said it sounded liturgical, like Gregorian chant. Others said it was more melodic, almost operatic. None could identify words or phrases. The sound was clear, distinct, and unnervingly close, yet no source could be located. A retired postal worker named Eugene Sandoval made the first audio recording. On the night of July 8th, he set up a cassette recorder on his porch and captured 18 minutes of the phenomenon. The tape was later analyzed by a linguistics professor at Arizona State University, Dr. Miriam Khalil, who described the recording as unmistakably vocal, but noted that the phonetic patterns did not correspond to any known language family. The harmonics were precise, the intervals mathematically consistent with Western choral music, but the melodic structure followed no recognizable tradition. Sandoval played the tape for other residents. They confirmed it matched what they had been hearing. He made copies and distributed them to neighbors, several of whom sent copies to family members out of state, hoping someone might recognize the language or style. No one did. By mid-July, the phenomenon was occurring almost nightly. Not all residents heard it. Some reported hearing nothing even when standing next to someone who claimed the singing was clear and loud. But among those who did hear it, the descriptions remained consistent. Multiple voices, harmonic, non-linguistic, and impossible to locate. A local mechanic named Ray Kowalski tried to track the source using a handheld CB radio and a directional antenna. He walked into the desert west of town on the night of July 23rd, following the sound. He reported that the singing seemed to recede as he approached, always remaining at the same perceived distance no matter how far he walked. After an hour, he gave up and returned home. The singing continued until just after midnight. In early August, a journalist from the Yuma Sun drove to Salome to investigate. Her name was Jessica Millard. She interviewed 8 residents, all of whom described the singing in nearly identical terms. She stayed overnight on August 6th, hoping to hear it herself. The night was clear and still. Shortly after 11 p.m., the singing began. Millard recorded it on a digital voice recorder. She described the experience in her article, published on August 15th, as profoundly disorienting, not frightening, but deeply strange, as though the desert itself were singing. Her article attracted attention from researchers at the University of Arizona. A team from the Department of Linguistics and the School of Anthropology arrived in Salome on August 20th. The team included Dr. Khalil, who had analyzed Sandoval's tape, and 2 graduate students, Nathan Alvarez and Jennifer Wu. They brought professional audio equipment, including parabolic microphones and spectrum analyzers, hoping to capture high-quality recordings and determine whether the sound was acoustic or electromagnetic in origin. They stayed for 5 nights. The singing occurred on 4 of them. The team recorded over 2 hours of audio. Analysis confirmed that the sound was acoustic, genuine sound waves traveling through air, not radio interference or auditory hallucination. The recordings showed clear vocal formants, harmonic overtones consistent with human voices, and no signs of electronic generation or amplification, but the direction of origin could not be determined. Parabolic microphones, designed to isolate sound from a specific direction, picked up the singing equally from all angles, as though it had no single point of origin. Dr. Khalil's final report, submitted to the university in September of 1998, stated, "The audio phenomenon observed in Salome, Arizona, exhibits characteristics consistent with human choral singing. However, the linguistic content, if any, does not correspond to any documented language. The spatial distribution of the sound is anomalous and suggests either a highly unusual acoustic environment or a source that is diffuse rather than localized." The report recommended further study. No funding was allocated. On September 7th, the singing stopped. It did not taper off or fade. It simply ceased. Residents who had heard it nightly throughout the summer reported complete silence. Several said they found the absence more unsettling than the sound itself. In October of 1998, a documentary crew from a regional television station visited Salome, hoping to produce a segment on the phenomenon. They interviewed residents and reviewed the audio recordings. But when they asked people to describe what they had heard, the responses were vague. Some said they remembered hearing something unusual but could not recall details. Others said they might have heard singing but were not certain. One resident, when played Sandoval's tape, said he did not recognize it. The crew left without completing the segment. In February of 1999, Dr. Khalil returned to Salome with a follow-up survey, intending to document long-term effects and gather additional witness statements. She found that most residents she had interviewed in August now claimed they had not heard anything unusual. Some acknowledged that others had reported strange sounds, but insisted they personally had not experienced anything out of the ordinary. Eugene Sandoval, who had made the first recording, said he still had the tape, but did not remember why he had made it. When Khalil played it for him, he listened quietly and said only that it could have been anything. Dorothy Schaefer, the woman who had made the first report to the sheriff's office, was no longer living in Salome. Neighbors said she had moved away in October of 1998, leaving no forwarding address. Khalil attempted to contact her through the school district where she had worked, but received no response. In her final notes, Khalil wrote, "The collective amnesia displayed by witnesses is inconsistent with normal memory decay." The phenomenon was recent, well documented, and widely discussed, yet within 6 months, nearly all participants have either retracted their accounts or claim no memory of the events. This suggests either coordinated denial or some form of retroactive suppression that I cannot explain. No further academic research was conducted. The audio recordings remain in the University of Arizona archives, filed under Unclassified Acoustic Phenomena. They are accessible to researchers but rarely requested. The town of Salome continues to exist, largely unchanged. The population remains small. The desert remains silent. But the tapes still play. And on them, Voices sing in a language that has no name, from a place that cannot be found, for reasons no one remembers or will admit to remembering. Some things appear only when no one is looking directly at them. Meteor Crater sits in the high desert of northern Arizona, 6 miles south of Interstate 40, near the town of Winslow. It is the best preserved impact crater on Earth, nearly 4,000 feet across and 550 feet deep, carved 50,000 years ago when a nickel-iron meteorite struck the Colorado Plateau at over 26,000 miles per hour. The impact vaporized the meteorite and ejected millions of tons of limestone and sandstone, scattering debris across hundreds of square miles. What remains is a nearly perfect bowl in the desert floor, surrounded by a raised rim of fractured rock and compressed sediment. The site is privately owned, operated as a museum and tourist attraction since 1946. Approximately 300,000 people visit each year, walking trails along the rim and viewing exhibits in the visitor center. The crater itself is fenced, closed to public access except for guided tours. At night, the site is empty. Security is minimal, a few cameras, motion sensors along the perimeter, and periodic patrols by contracted guards. The nearest town, Winslow, is 18 miles west. The desert around the crater is open range, unfenced and largely uninhabited. In the summer of 2010, the site's management upgraded its security system, installing a network of infrared cameras to monitor the rim and parking areas after hours. The cameras were motion-activated, recording only when movement was detected. The system was designed to deter vandalism and trespassing, both of which had been occasional problems. On the morning of August 3, 2010, a security technician named Brian Pacheco was reviewing footage from the previous night when he noticed something unusual. One of the cameras, positioned to cover the northwestern section of the rim, had recorded a 2-minute clip at 3:17 a.m. The clip showed a human figure standing motionless at the crater's edge, facing inward toward the bowl. The figure was visible only in infrared, a heat signature, white against the dark background of cool rock and desert air. When Pacheco switched to the standard visible light footage from the same camera, the figure was not there. Pacheco assumed it was a technical glitch, perhaps a reflection or a processing artifact. He filed a maintenance note and thought nothing more of it. The figure appeared again on August 7th. Same camera, same time, 3:72 a.m., same location on the rim. The infrared signature was clear, humanoid, approximately 6 feet tall, standing upright with arms at its sides. The figure remained stationary for 2 minutes, then vanished. Motion sensors along that section of the rim showed no activation. Standard cameras showed nothing. Pacheco mentioned it to his supervisor, a man named Carl Hoffman, who had managed security at the crater for 8 years. Hoffman reviewed the footage, personally. He agreed the image was unusual, but suggested it might be a thermal echo, residual heat from the ground or equipment. He asked Pacheco to monitor the system and report any additional occurrences. The figure appeared again on August 11th, and again on August 15th, always at 3:17 a.m., always in the same position, always visible only on infrared. By the end of August, it had appeared 7 times. Hoffman contacted the company that had installed the cameras, requesting a technician to inspect the equipment. The technician arrived on September 2nd and spent 2 days testing the system. He found no malfunctions. The cameras were operating correctly. The infrared sensors were calibrated. The motion detection system was functioning as designed. He could offer no explanation for the figure. Hoffman began conducting physical patrols of the rim at 3:17 a.m. On September 9th, he walked the northwestern section of the crater with a flashlight and a handheld radio. The night was clear, the temperature in the low 60s. He saw nothing. At 3:20 a.m., he returned to the security office and reviewed the footage from that night. The figure had appeared. Same time, same place. While he had been standing less than 50 yards away, he had seen nothing. Over the following months, the figure continued to appear, not every night, but frequently, with no discernible pattern. Hoffman documented each occurrence in a logbook, noting the date, time, and duration. He also began checking other cameras. The figure appeared only on the northwestern rim camera. It never moved. It never gestured. It simply stood, facing the crater, for exactly 2 minutes, then disappeared. In December of 2010, Hoffman shared the footage with a colleague who worked in law enforcement, hoping for insight. The colleague suggested the figure might be a person using thermal camouflage or some kind of stealth technology. Hoffman found the explanation implausible. No one had been detected entering or leaving the site, and the figure appeared in temperatures and weather conditions that would make thermal camouflage ineffective. By the spring of 2011, the figure had appeared over 50 times. Hoffman compiled the footage and submitted a report to the crater's ownership, a family trust that had managed the site since the 1950s. The trust declined to pursue further investigation, stating that as long as no damage or trespassing was occurring, the matter was not a priority. Hoffman was instructed to continue monitoring, but not to discuss the phenomenon with staff or visitors. In 2012, a graduate student in geophysics named Laura Finch visited the crater as part of a research project on impact geology. During her visit, she mentioned to a museum staff member that she was interested in unusual electromagnetic phenomena. The staff member, who had heard rumors about the security footage, mentioned the figure. Finch asked to see the recordings. Hoffman, with reluctance, showed her a compilation video. Finch was intrigued. She hypothesized that the figure might be a form of atmospheric plasma or a thermal mirage caused by temperature inversions over the crater. She requested permission to set up monitoring equipment on the rim overnight. The request was denied by the site's management. Undeterred, Finch returned to the crater in July of 2012 and conducted observations from public land adjacent to the site. She brought infrared binoculars and a thermal imaging camera. On the night of July 14th, at 3:17 a.m., she observed the rim from a distance of approximately 1 mile. She saw nothing through the binoculars. Her thermal camera recorded a faint heat signature at the location where the security camera consistently captured the figure, but the image was indistinct, obscured by distance and atmospheric interference. Finch wrote a paper describing her observations and submitted it to a journal specializing in geophysical anomalies. The paper was rejected. Reviewers noted that without access to the original security footage or controlled measurements at the site, her findings were inconclusive. She did not pursue publication elsewhere. By 2015, the figure had appeared over 150 times. Hoffman, who had retired in 2014, continued to follow the reports through a contact still working at the crater. The new security team had been briefed on the phenomenon but was instructed not to investigate. The cameras continued recording. The figure continued appearing. In 2018, a freelance journalist named Derek Ostrander learned about the footage through a source in the security industry. He contacted the crater's management, requesting an interview and access to the recordings. His request was denied. He filed a Freedom of Information Act request, arguing that, as a scientific site of national interest, the crater's security data should be public. The request was denied on the grounds that the site is privately owned and not subject to FOIA regulations. Ostrander published a brief article in an online magazine describing the phenomenon based on second-hand accounts. The article attracted little attention and was later removed at the request of the site's legal team. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the crater was closed to visitors for several months. Security footage from that period shows the figure continued to appear on schedule, unaffected by the closure. No staff were on site during most of those appearances. The cameras recorded automatically. As of 2024, the figure has been recorded over 200 times. The appearances remain consistent: 3:17 to 3:19 a.m., northwestern rim, infrared signature only, no motion sensor activation, no physical. Presence detected during patrols. Current security staff are aware of the phenomenon but are instructed not to discuss it. The cameras continue recording. The footage is archived but not analyzed. Management maintains that the figure poses no threat and that further investigation is unnecessary, but the figure is still there, standing at the edge of a hole torn into the earth 50,000 years ago, visible only to machines appearing at the same moment each time, watching something no one else can see. And every night it appears, the cameras record it, and every morning the desert is empty. There are flight paths that exist only on certain nights, and only for those watching at the right time. Gila Bend sits in the Sonoran Desert of southwestern Arizona, a small town of fewer than 2,000 people pressed between Interstate 8 and vast stretches of military reservation land. The town exists primarily as a service stop for travelers crossing between Yuma and Phoenix, offering fuel, food, and little else. But surrounding Gila Bend are over 2 million acres of restricted airspace, controlled by the Marine Corps and used for air combat training, weapons testing, and flight operations that the public rarely hears about. The Barry M. Goldwater Range sprawls to the south and west. The Gila Bend Air Force Auxiliary Field lies just east of town, a sprawling complex of runways and hangars that has trained military pilots since World War II. The airspace above Gila Bend is among the most controlled in Arizona. Every aircraft entering the region must file a flight plan, maintain radio contact, and receive clearance from the Military Air Traffic Control. Unauthorized incursions are rare and treated seriously. The skies are monitored continuously by radar installations that track everything from commercial airliners at 35,000 feet to small private planes skimming the desert at low altitude. In the fall of 2006, an air traffic controller named Vincent Kowalczyk was working the night shift at the Marine Corps Air Station Yuma, responsible for monitoring airspace over the Gila Bend sector. The shift was typically quiet. Most training flights occurred during daylight hours, and civilian traffic through the region was minimal after dark. On the night of October 19, 2006, a Thursday, Kowalczyk's radar detected an aircraft entering the controlled airspace from the northwest at 11:52 p.m. The target appeared suddenly, without prior warning, moving southeast at approximately 220 knots at an altitude of 8,000 feet. Kowalczyk attempted radio contact on standard aviation frequencies. There was no response. He checked his logs. No flight plan had been filed for that corridor. No civilian or military aircraft were scheduled to transit the area at that time. He attempted contact again using emergency frequencies. Still no response. The aircraft continued on its course, flying in a perfectly straight line across the restricted zone. Kowalczyk tracked it for 7 minutes. At 11:59 p.m., the radar signature vanished. Not faded, vanished, as though the aircraft had simply ceased to exist. Kowalczyk filed an incident report. Air traffic control incidents involving unidentified aircraft are taken seriously, particularly in restricted military airspace. The report was forwarded to the FAA and to Marine Corps Aviation Command. An investigation was opened. 3 weeks later, on November 9th, another Thursday, the same thing happened. Same time, 11:52 p.m. Same entry point, same altitude, speed, and heading. Same lack of radio response. Same disappearance at 11:59 p.m. This time, Kowalczyk was prepared. He had alerted his supervisor, a retired Navy pilot named Lieutenant Colonel James Braddock, who observed the radar track in real time. Braddock confirmed the sighting and immediately contacted the FAA regional office in Albuquerque. He also ordered a patrol aircraft to investigate, but by the time the patrol reached the area, the target had disappeared. The aircraft appeared again on November 30th, and again on December 21st, always on Thursday, always at 11:52 p.m., always following the exact same flight path. By January of 2007, Kowalczyk and Braddock had documented the pattern. The aircraft appeared every third Thursday without fail. It entered the airspace from a point approximately 40 miles northwest of Gila Bend, near the boundary of the Tohono O'odham Nation, and flew southeast across the Barry M. Goldwater Range, exiting near the town of Ajo. The flight path crossed no commercial routes, no known landing strips, and no areas of civilian activity. The altitude and speed remained constant. The radar signature was consistent with a small, fixed-wing aircraft, likely a single-engine plane based on the return profile. But no such aircraft could be found. The FAA launched a formal investigation in February of 2007. Investigators interviewed air traffic controllers, reviewed radar data, and checked records of all registered aircraft in Arizona, Southern California, and northern Mexico. They found no flight plans matching the observed path. No pilots reported flying in that area at those times. No aircraft were reported missing or overdue. The FAA also checked with civilian radar installations, including those operated by the National Weather Service and commercial aviation tracking systems. None of them detected the aircraft. The radar signature appeared only on military systems monitoring the Gila Bend sector. Lieutenant Colonel Braddock proposed a theory. The aircraft might be flying below radar coverage in most areas, climbing to 8,000 feet only when crossing the military reservation, then descending again before exiting controlled airspace. This would explain why civilian radar did not detect it, but it did not explain the precision of the timing, the identical flight path, or the complete lack of radio communication. In April of 2007, the Marine Corps dispatched an F/A-18 Hornet to intercept the aircraft. The pilot, whose name was not released in official reports, was instructed to visually identify the target and, if necessary, force it to land at the auxiliary field in Gila Bend. The intercept was scheduled for April 12th, the next predicted appearance. At 11:52 p.m., the radar target appeared. The F/A-18 was vectored to intercept. The pilot reported acquiring the target on his radar and closing to within 5 miles. But when he reached the intercept point, he saw nothing. No aircraft, no lights, no contrail. His onboard radar showed the target directly ahead, but visual confirmation was negative. The pilot requested guidance. Ground control confirmed the target was still on radar, co-located with the fighter's position. The pilot descended to 7,000 feet, then climbed to 9,000, attempting to spot the aircraft above or below him. He saw nothing. At 11:59 p.m., both radar signatures, the fighter and the unknown aircraft, were visible on ground control screens. Then the unknown target vanished. The pilot returned to base. In his debriefing, the pilot stated, "I was exactly where radar said the target was. There was nothing there. Either the radar was wrong or the thing I was chasing wasn't physical." The FAA investigation continued through 2008. Additional intercept attempts were made on June 7th and July 26th. Both times, the result was identical. Radar contact, no visual confirmation, disappearance at 11:59 p.m. Theories proliferated. Some investigators suggested the radar returns were caused by atmospheric anomalies, temperature inversions, or moisture layers that could produce false targets. But atmospheric phenomena do not appear on a fixed schedule, at a fixed time, following a fixed path. Others suggested the aircraft might be a drone, possibly operated by a foreign government or a private entity conducting illegal surveillance. But no drone wreckage was ever found. No operators were identified, and the technology required to evade visual detection while maintaining a radar signature was beyond anything known to be operational at the time. A former Air Force radar technician named Gerald Oakes, who reviewed the data as part of an independent consultation, noted that the radar signature exhibited characteristics inconsistent with conventional aircraft. The return was too clean, too stable. Real aircraft produce fluctuating radar signatures due to changes in aspect angle, atmospheric conditions, and minor course corrections. The Gila Bend target produced a signature that looked, in Oakes's words, like a computer simulation, perfect, unchanging, as though it were following a programmed path rather than being piloted. In September of 2008, the FAA closed its investigation without reaching a conclusion. The final report stated, "An unidentified radar target has been observed on multiple occasions in restricted airspace near Gila Bend, Arizona. The target exhibits consistent flight characteristics but has not been visually confirmed or correlated with any known aircraft. The source of the radar returns remains undetermined." The flights continued every third Thursday, 11:52 p.m., 7-minute duration, no deviation, until March of 2009. On March 12, 2009, the aircraft did not appear. Air traffic controllers waited. 11:52 p.m. came and went. The radar screens remained empty. It did not appear on April 2nd, or April 23rd, or any Thursday after that. The flights had stopped. No explanation was offered. No incident had occurred. No changes had been made to radar systems or monitoring procedures. The aircraft simply ceased to appear as abruptly and inexplicably as it had begun. Vincent Kowalczyk, the controller who had first documented the phenomenon, retired from air traffic control in 2011. In a conversation with a colleague shortly before his retirement, he said, "I spent 3 years watching that thing cross my screen. Every time I thought maybe this time I'd understand it, but it was always the same. And then it stopped, and I realized I understood it even less." You spend your career assuming everything in the sky has an explanation. That thing taught me otherwise. The radar data remains archived in FAA records, classified under unexplained anomalies. Access requires special clearance. No follow-up investigations have been conducted. The airspace over Gila Bend is still restricted. Training flights continue. Radar systems still monitor every aircraft. And every third Thursday at 11:52 p.m., the screens remain empty. But those who watched it know that for 3 years, something flew across that desert on a schedule no one could explain, following a path no one had authorized, and then vanished as though it had never existed at all. Some photographs capture places that should not yet exist. Canyon de Chelly sits in the heart of the Navajo Nation in northeastern Arizona, a system of red sandstone gorges that have sheltered human habitation for nearly 5,000 years. The canyon runs roughly east to west for 26 miles, its walls rising as high as 1,000 feet above a sandy floor dotted with cottonwood trees and the ruins of ancestral Puebloan dwellings. Spider Rock, an 800-foot sandstone spire, stands near the junction of Canyon de Chelly and Monument Canyon, a formation sacred to the Navajo and used as a landmark by travelers for centuries. The National Park Service has managed Canyon de Chelly since 1931, though the land itself remains under Navajo jurisdiction. Visitors can view the canyon from overlooks along the rim, but access to the canyon floor requires a Navajo guide, except along one trail, White House Ruins, which the public can walk unescorted. The restriction exists to protect both the archaeological sites and the privacy of Navajo families who still live and farm within the canyon. Most of the interior remains difficult to reach, accessed only by rough jeep trails and footpaths that follow the sandy washes between the cliffs. Spider Rock Overlook, one of the most popular viewpoints, sits at the end of South Rim Drive, offering a clear view of the spire and the surrounding canyon walls. The overlook was developed in the 1960s with a paved parking area and viewing platform constructed in 1967. Before that, the area was accessible only by foot or horseback, and few records exist of non-Navajo visitors reaching that specific point. On May 6, 2015, a Park Service maintenance worker named Daniel Sosi was repairing a section of fence near Spider Rock Overlook when he noticed something unusual. A section of ground near the cliff edge had subsided slightly, creating a shallow depression. Concerned about erosion, Sosi began examining the area and found a metal box partially exposed in the dirt, approximately 18 inches below the surface. The box was a military-style ammunition container, heavily rusted but still sealed. Sosi reported the find to the park superintendent, Margaret Whitfield, who authorized its removal and inspection. The box was taken to the park's administrative office in Chinle, where it was opened under controlled conditions. Inside were 16 Polaroid photographs, each wrapped individually in waxed paper. The photographs were in remarkably good condition, protected from moisture and light by the sealed container. Each image showed the same subject, a sandstone cliff face, photographed from slightly different angles, as though someone had walked along a rim or ledge, taking pictures every few steps. The cliff face was immediately recognizable. It was the eastern wall of Canyon de Chelly, visible from Spider Rock Overlook, showing distinctive features including a prominent alcove, several vertical fractures, and a dark stain caused by mineral seepage. But the photographs were dated. On the back of each image, written in blue ballpoint ink, was a date, July 19, 1952. Whitfield contacted a photographic preservation specialist at Northern Arizona University, Dr. Lisa Yamamoto, who examined the images. Yamamoto confirmed the photographs were genuine Polaroids, consistent with film stock produced in the early 1950s. The paper degradation, fading patterns, and chemical composition all supported the stated date. The ink used for the notation was also consistent with ballpoint pens available in that era. But there was a problem. The overlook from which the photographs were taken did not exist in 1952. The viewing platform was not constructed until 1967. The land was undeveloped, difficult to access, and not part of any established trail. While it was technically possible someone could have hiked to that location in 1952, there would have been no reason to do so. The area was isolated, with no structures, no marked paths, and no known historical significance beyond its proximity to Spider Rock. More troubling was what the photographs showed. Dr. Yamamoto compared the images to contemporary photographs of the same cliff face. The match was nearly perfect. The alcove, the fractures, the mineral stain, all were present in the 1952 photographs exactly as they appeared in 2015. Whitfield requested a geological analysis. A team from the University of Arizona's Department of Geosciences, led by Dr. Raymond Falk, examined the cliff face in person and compared it to the Polaroids. Falk's preliminary assessment, completed in July of 2015, noted significant inconsistencies. The mineral staining visible in the photographs should not have been present in 1952. Mineral seepage is a slow process caused by water percolating through porous sandstone and depositing iron oxide and other minerals on the surface. Based on the size and intensity of the stain in the photographs, Falk estimated it would have taken at least 30 years to develop, meaning it should not have become visible until the 1980s or later. Similarly, one of the vertical fractures visible in the images showed weathering patterns consistent with decades of exposure to freeze-thaw cycles. The fracture appeared fresh in the photographs, yet displayed erosion characteristics that, according to Falk's analysis, would require 20 to 30 years to develop from the point of initial cracking. The photographs, in other words, showed the cliff face as it appeared in 2015, not as it would have appeared in 1952. Falk's report raised more questions than it answered. He wrote, Either the photographs were taken recently and falsely dated, or they depict a state of geological weathering that should not have existed in the 1950s. I can find no natural explanation for the latter. Whitfield contacted the FBI's art crime team, suspecting the photographs might be forgeries created as part of a hoax or illegal artifact scheme. 2 agents visited the park in August of 2015 and examined the box and photographs. They found no evidence of forgery. The container's rust patterns were consistent with decades of burial. Soil samples taken from inside the box matched the composition of soil at the burial site, and pollen analysis suggested the box had been sealed and buried sometime in the mid-20th century, consistent with the date on the photographs. The agents also noted that the photographs had no obvious monetary or historical value. They depicted an unremarkable cliff face from an angle accessible to any visitor. There was no clear motive for creating such a forgery. The case was closed without resolution. In September of 2015, Whitfield interviewed several elderly Navajo residents who had lived near the canyon for most of their lives, hoping someone might recall visitors or unusual activity near Spider Rock in the 1950s. Most had no memory of outsiders in that area during that period. One man, a shepherd named Thomas Benally, said his father had mentioned finding survey markers near Spider Rock in the late 1940s or early 50s, possibly left by government geologists or engineers. But no records of such surveys exist in Park Service or Bureau of Land Management archives. Whitfield also consulted with Navajo cultural advisors, who noted that Spider Rock holds spiritual significance and that certain areas around it are considered sensitive or restricted. One advisor mentioned an old story about photographers who came to the canyon in the past and took pictures of things that had not happened yet, though he could not provide specifics and acknowledged the story might be apocryphal. In November of 2015, Dr. Yamamoto conducted a detailed forensic analysis of the photographs, looking for evidence of digital manipulation or analog tampering. She found none. The images were chemically consistent with unaltered Polaroid film. There were no signs of double exposure, paste-up techniques, or other forms of photographic trickery common in the mid-20th century. Yamamoto's final report concluded, "The photographs are genuine Polaroids from the 1950s. The geological features they depict match the current state of the cliff face, but should not have been visible at the time the photographs were taken. I cannot explain this discrepancy." The photographs were archived in the park's collection, cataloged under unattributed historical materials. The metal box was preserved as well. Both remain accessible to researchers, though few have requested to view them. In 2018, a geology graduate student named Patrick Reeves visited the park as part of a thesis project on sandstone weathering rates. He reviewed the photographs and Falk's analysis. Reeves proposed that the mineral staining and fracture weathering might have occurred more rapidly than expected due to localized conditions, perhaps unusual water flow or seismic activity. But he could not identify any evidence of such conditions in the area, and his hypothesis remains untested. The burial site near Spider Rock Overlook was examined again in 2019 using ground-penetrating radar, in case additional items were buried nearby. Nothing was found. No one has come forward to claim the photographs. No records have surfaced documenting who took them, why they were buried, or how they captured a cliff face that should not have looked the way it did for another 30 years. The overlook remains open to visitors. The cliff face remains unchanged, its features slowly eroding in ways that geologists can predict and measure. And somewhere in the park's archive, 16 photographs wait in a sealed box, showing a place that existed before it should have, taken by someone who saw what had not yet occurred. There are places where the air refuses to warm and no one can explain why. Tucson Mountain Park sprawls across nearly 25,000 acres on the western edge of Tucson, Arizona, a desert landscape of saguaro cacti, palo verde trees, and volcanic rock formations that rise in jagged ridges against the sky. The park was established in 1961, carved from land that had been open range and mining claims since the territorial period. The terrain is typical Sonoran desert, hot, dry, and unforgiving. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 105 degrees. Winter nights drop to the 40s. The park receives fewer than 12 inches of rain per year, most of it arriving during the monsoon season between July and September. The western section of the park, near the boundary with the Tohono O'odham Nation, is less visited than the areas closer to town. The trails are rough, poorly marked, and often impassable after storms. There are no facilities, no water sources, and no cell phone coverage. It is the kind of place where people go to be alone, to hike in silence, or to disappear for a few hours into landscape that has not changed much in 10,000 years. In the fall of 1996, a retired schoolteacher named Howard Gilstrap was hiking in the western section of the park, following a dry wash that wound between two low ridges. Gilstrap was an amateur meteorologist who carried a handheld thermometer on his hikes, recording temperature and humidity as part of a personal project to document microclimates in the Tucson Basin. He had been doing this for years, accumulating notebooks full of data that he occasionally shared with the University of Arizona's Department of Atmospheric Sciences. On October 3, 1996, Gilstrap recorded something unusual. As he walked through a section of the wash, the temperature dropped suddenly. He stopped and checked his thermometer. It read 79 degrees Fahrenheit. He walked back 20 paces. The thermometer climbed to 90 degrees. He walked forward again. The temperature dropped back to 79. Gilstrap marked the spot with a cairn and spent the next 2 hours mapping the boundary of the temperature anomaly. He found that the cooler air was confined to a roughly circular area, approximately half a mile in diameter. The boundary was sharp. Within the span of a few steps, the temperature difference was noticeable not just on his thermometer, but on his skin. The air inside the zone felt noticeably cooler, almost as though he had walked into the shade, though the sun was directly overhead and there were no clouds. Gilstrap returned to the site 3 more times over the next 2 weeks, always finding the same result. The temperature inside the zone was consistently 11 degrees cooler than the surrounding desert. He submitted his findings to the University of Arizona, along with his notes and GPS coordinates. A graduate student in atmospheric sciences, Marcus De Leon, read Gilstrap's report and decided to investigate. In November of 1996, De Leon hiked to the site with portable weather instruments, including a digital thermometer, a barometer, and a humidity sensor. He confirmed Gilstrap's observations. The temperature inside the zone was 11 degrees cooler. The humidity was slightly higher, but not enough to account for the temperature difference. Air pressure was normal. There was no wind differential. De Leon expanded the study. Over the next 6 months, he visited the site weekly, recording measurements at different times of day and under different weather conditions. The temperature difference remained constant. In summer, when the surrounding desert reached 108 degrees, the zone measured 97. In winter, when the ambient temperature was 62, the zone was 51. The difference never varied by more than 1 degree. De Leon's advisor, Dr. Patricia Rourke, was skeptical. She suggested the anomaly might be caused by underground water, which could cool the ground and create a localized temperature inversion. De Leon used a ground-penetrating radar unit borrowed from the geology department to scan the area. He found no evidence of subsurface water. The soil composition was identical to the surrounding desert, dry, compacted, and largely devoid of organic material. Rourke then proposed that the anomaly might be related to elevation. Even small changes in altitude can create measurable temperature differences. De Leon conducted a topographic survey using a laser rangefinder. The zone was flat, with no elevation change greater than 3 feet across its entire diameter. The surrounding ridges were too distant to provide shade or alter wind patterns. In May of 1997, Rourke visited the site herself. She brought a team of 3 graduate students and a full suite of meteorological equipment, including a portable weather station, infrared thermometers, and anemometers to measure wind speed and direction. They spent 8 hours at the site, taking measurements every 15 minutes. The results were consistent with De Leon's earlier findings. The temperature inside the zone was 11 degrees cooler. The boundary was sharp and stable. No conventional meteorological factors could account for it. Rourke wrote a brief paper describing the anomaly and submitted it to the Journal of Applied Meteorology. The paper was rejected. Reviewers noted that the phenomenon was insufficiently explained and suggested that measurement error or equipment malfunction was the most likely cause. Rourke resubmitted with additional data. The paper was rejected again, this time without detailed review. But word of the anomaly began to spread. Hikers who visited the site reported feeling the temperature drop. Some described it as refreshing, a pocket of coolness in the otherwise relentless desert heat. Others found it unsettling, an unnatural break in the landscape's normal patterns. In 2001, a local naturalist named Sandra Kowalski began documenting plant growth inside the zone. She noticed that vegetation within the cooler area grew more slowly than plants just outside the boundary. Saguaro cacti inside the zone were noticeably smaller than those of comparable age outside it. Creosote bushes showed reduced annual growth rings. Palo Verde trees inside the zone appeared younger, despite being the same species and presumably the same age as trees in the surrounding area. Kowalski shared her observations with the Desert Botanical Laboratory in Tucson. A botanist named Dr. Elena Vargas conducted a formal study in 2003 comparing plant growth rates inside and outside the zone. Her findings confirmed Kowalski's observations. Plants inside the zone grew approximately 30% slower than those outside. Soil samples showed no differences in nutrient content or composition. Water availability was identical. The only measurable difference was temperature. Vargas hypothesized that the cooler temperatures were slowing metabolic processes in the plants, reducing photosynthesis and growth rates. But she could not explain why the temperature was lower in the first place. In 2007, the anomaly attracted attention from the U.S. Geological Survey. A team of geologists, led by Dr. Kenneth Bragg, conducted a comprehensive survey of the area, looking for geological explanations. They used seismic imaging to map subsurface structures, magnetic surveys to detect unusual mineral deposits, and thermal imaging to identify heat sources or sinks. They found nothing unusual. The bedrock was typical Tucson Basin geology, layered sediment and volcanic intrusions, consistent with the surrounding area. There were no caves, no voids, no underground streams. The magnetic field was normal. Thermal imaging confirmed the surface temperature anomaly, but provided no insight into its cause. Bragg's report, completed in 2008, stated, "The temperature anomaly near Tucson Mountain Park is real and persistent. However, we have been unable to identify a geological or hydrological mechanism that would account for it. The phenomenon remains unexplained." In 2012, satellite data became publicly available through NASA's Landsat program. A researcher at the University of Arizona, Dr. Oliver Nunez, analyzed thermal infrared images of the Tucson area and immediately identified the cold zone. It appeared as a distinct circular feature, consistently cooler than the surrounding terrain, visible in every image taken since the satellite began collecting data in 1984. The anomaly had existed for at least 12 years before Gilstrap first documented it on the ground. Nunez attempted to publish his findings, but journals were reluctant to accept the paper without a plausible explanation for the phenomenon. One reviewer wrote, "The data are compelling, but without a physical mechanism to explain the observation, the paper contributes little to our understanding of atmospheric or geological processes." Nunez did not pursue publication further, but he did share the satellite images with colleagues, several of whom visited the site and confirmed the temperature anomaly firsthand. None could explain it. By 2015, the cold zone had been documented by more than 30 researchers, amateur meteorologists, and curious hikers. The temperature difference remained constant. The boundaries remained sharp, and no credible explanation had been proposed. Some suggested the anomaly was related to ancient volcanic activity, though no evidence of recent thermal activity exists in the area. Others proposed that it might be caused by unusual atmospheric circulation patterns, though such patterns would not produce a stable, sharply bounded temperature difference lasting decades. A few speculated about underground ice deposits or permafrost, but ground-penetrating radar and core samples found no evidence of frozen water. In 2018, a documentary filmmaker visited the site and recorded a segment on the phenomenon. The footage clearly showed the temperature drop as the crew crossed the boundary. One crew member described it as like walking through an invisible wall of cool air. The segment aired locally but attracted little national attention. The zone remains accessible to hikers, though it is difficult to reach and rarely visited. There are no signs, no markers, no acknowledgement from park authorities that anything unusual exists there. The temperature continues to measure 11 degrees cooler than the surrounding desert, day and night, summer and winter, with a consistency that defies natural explanation. And the plants inside continue to grow slowly, as though time itself moves differently within that half-mile circle, where the air is always cooler and the desert refuses to follow its own rules. There are reflections that appear where nothing should reflect. Ajo sits in the southwestern corner of Arizona, 30 miles from the Mexican border, in a basin surrounded by low mountain ranges and creosote flats. The town exists because of copper. In 1911, the New Cornelia Copper Company began open-pit mining operations that would eventually create a pit nearly 2 miles across and 800 feet deep. For decades, Ajo thrived. The population peaked at 6,000 in the 1970s. Then the copper played out. The mine closed in 1985. Most of the workers left. What remains is a quiet town of fewer than 4,000 people, surrounded by abandoned equipment, tailings piles, and miles of desert that still bear the scars of extraction. The old mine infrastructure spreads for miles beyond the pit itself. Access roads, maintenance sheds, power substations, and scattered clusters of concrete foundations where processing facilities once stood. Much of it is fenced and posted with no trespassing signs, though enforcement is sporadic. The desert has begun reclaiming the land. Creosote and Palo Verde grow through cracked pavement. Wind scours the exposed metal until it shines dull in the sun. In the fall of 2002, a contract security guard named Victor Salazar was conducting an evening patrol of the abandoned mine facilities west of Ajo. His job was to check fences and gates, deter scrap metal thieves, and report any signs of vandalism or trespassing. The work was solitary and uneventful. Most evenings he saw nothing but desert and the remnants of industrial infrastructure slowly collapsing under its own weight. On October 7, 2002, Salazar was driving along a dirt access road near a cluster of abandoned storage buildings when he saw something in the sky ahead of him. At first, he thought it was a mirage, heat shimmer or dust, but the air was cooling. The sun was low on the horizon, and the image was too distinct to be atmospheric distortion. It was a reflection. A human figure, suspended in the air approximately 20 feet above the ground, motionless, facing away from him. The figure appeared to be wearing work clothes, dark pants, a light-colored shirt. The image was faint but unmistakable, like looking at someone standing on the other side of a pane of glass. Salazar stopped his truck. The figure remained. He stepped out. The figure did not move. He walked closer, slowly, watching the image. It stayed where it was, hanging in empty air, slightly translucent but clearly defined. He could see the contour of shoulders, the shape of a head, the line of legs. He was within 50 feet when he realized the figure looked familiar. The clothes, the build, the posture, it looked like him. He raised his right hand. The figure did not respond. It simply stood or hung motionless in the air, facing away. Salazar retreated to his truck and called his supervisor, a man named Dennis Kowalski. He described what he was seeing. Kowalski told him to take a photograph. Salazar retrieved a disposable camera from his glove box and took 3 pictures. The figure remained visible the entire time. Then, as the sun touched the horizon, the image faded. Not suddenly, gradually, dissolving over the span of maybe 10 seconds until there was nothing but empty sky. When Salazar had the film developed, the photographs showed only sky. No figure, no reflection, nothing. 2 weeks later, on October 21st, a maintenance worker named Angela Furtado was inspecting a section of chain-link fence in the same area. She had worked at the mine before it closed and still did occasional contract work for the company that managed the property. It was late afternoon. She was alone. She saw her reflection in the air. Not directly in front of her, off to the side, maybe 30 yards away, suspended above a patch of gravel and dried grass. The figure was facing away, dressed in jeans and a work jacket. Her work jacket, the one she was wearing. Furtado walked toward it. The reflection did not move. She circled it, slowly, keeping her distance. The figure remained stationary, always facing the same direction, east, toward the mountains. She called out. No response. She waved her arms. The figure did not react. She returned to her truck and retrieved a video camera she used for documenting fence damage. She filmed the area where the figure hung. When she reviewed the footage later that evening, it showed only empty desert. But while she had been there, the reflection had been visible, clear, undeniable. Furtado reported the incident to Kowalski, who by now had heard similar accounts from Salazar and was beginning to take the reports seriously. Kowalski visited the area himself on November 2nd, accompanied by another security guard, a man named Luis Herrera. They arrived at dusk and waited. The reflection appeared at 6:14 p.m. Both men saw it. A human figure suspended in the air, facing east. It was not either of them. The build was different, the posture unfamiliar, but it was clearly a reflection of someone. The figure remained visible for approximately 8 minutes, then faded as darkness settled over the desert. Kowalski took photographs with a digital camera. Herrera recorded video on his phone. Neither device captured the image. Both men confirmed what they had seen. Both were certain it had been there. Over the next 3 years, the phenomenon was reported 16 times. All sightings occurred in the same general area, a square mile of abandoned mine property west of Ajo. All occurred at dusk, within 30 minutes of sunset. All involved human figures, always facing away from the observer, always suspended in air above the desert floor. In every case, the figure appeared to be a reflection of the person witnessing it, though the details were sometimes unclear. Most witnesses reported that the figure did not move, did not respond to sound or motion, and faded after several minutes. Several attempted to photograph or film the phenomenon. None succeeded. Cameras showed only sky. A few witnesses reported additional details. A truck driver named Raymond Diaz, who saw his reflection on March 3, 2003, noted that the figure appeared slightly transparent, like looking through tinted glass. A retired miner named Samuel Ortega, who witnessed the phenomenon on June 12, 2004, said the reflections seemed to shimmer as though affected by heat, though the temperature was dropping as evening set in. In July of 2004, Kowalski compiled the reports and contacted a physics professor at the University of Arizona, Dr. Helena Rostova, hoping for an explanation. Rostova reviewed the accounts and suggested the phenomenon might be related to atmospheric optics, perhaps a form of superior mirage caused by temperature inversions. But superior mirages typically reflect objects on the ground, projecting them upward. They do not create images of the observer, and they are usually visible to cameras. Rostova visited the site on August 19, 2004, accompanied by 2 graduate students. They brought optical instruments, including spectrometers and polarizing filters, hoping to measure the properties of the reflected light. They waited until dusk. The phenomenon did not appear. They returned on September 9th. Again, nothing. Rostova concluded that without direct observation under controlled conditions, she could not determine the cause. She did note, however, that the consistency of the reports, multiple witnesses, similar descriptions, specific location and timing, suggested the phenomenon was real, not a shared hallucination or hoax. In October of 2004, the local newspaper, the Ajo Copper News, published a brief article about the sightings. The article was cautious, presenting the accounts without embellishment and noting that no photographic evidence existed. The article generated some interest. A television crew from Tucson visited the site in November, hoping to film a segment. They waited 2 evenings and saw nothing. The final documented sighting occurred on April 6, 2005. A geologist conducting a survey of abandoned mine sites, Dr. Marcus D. Leon, saw a figure in the air while driving through the area at dusk. He stopped, observed it for several minutes, and noted its location on his GPS. He attempted to photograph it with a high-resolution camera. The images showed nothing. After April of 2005, the sighting stopped. No one reported seeing the reflections again. Kowalski continued patrols of the area for another 2 years before retiring. He occasionally mentioned the phenomenon to colleagues, but no new reports emerged. In 2008, a documentary filmmaker contacted several of the witnesses, hoping to produce a segment on the Ajo reflections. Most agreed to be interviewed. All described the same experience: a clear, visible reflection of themselves, suspended in air, facing away, unresponsive, fading at nightfall. And all confirmed that cameras had failed to capture it. The filmmaker visited the site and interviewed locals. A few mentioned old stories about the mine, workers who had died in accidents, unexplained equipment failures, a general sense that certain areas of the property were unsettling. But no one connected these stories to the reflections. The phenomenon was too specific, too strange to fit into familiar narratives of hauntings or curses. The documentary was never completed. Funding ran out, and the filmmaker moved on to other projects. The raw interview footage remains in a private archive, rarely viewed. The area west of Ajo remains abandoned. Fences are rusted, buildings are collapsing, the desert continues its slow work of erasure, and the reflections, if they still appear, go unwitnessed. But the accounts remain. 16 people over 3 years, all describing the same thing. A reflection where nothing should reflect. A figure that appears only to the eye, never to the lens. Always at dusk, always facing away, and always unmistakably themselves. Some rhythms exist beneath the surface, counting time that no one set in motion. Casa Grande Ruins National Monument sits in the flat agricultural land of south-central Arizona, midway between Phoenix and Tucson. The centerpiece is a 4-story structure built by the Hohokam people sometime in the early 1400s. a massive earthen building that rises from the desert floor like a relic from another world. The Hohokam abandoned the site around 1450 for reasons that remain unclear. When Spanish explorers arrived in the 1600s, the structure was already ancient, its purpose forgotten. The walls are made of caliche, a cement-like mixture of soil and calcium carbonate, packed and shaped by hand. Despite 7 centuries of exposure to sun, wind, and rain, much of the structure remains intact, protected since 1918, under a massive steel canopy erected to shield it from further weathering. The monument covers 472 acres. Most of it is open desert scrub, creosote, mesquite, and prickly pear cactus. The ruins themselves occupy a small fraction of that area. Archaeologists have mapped the site extensively, uncovering the remnants of canals, compounds, and smaller structures that once surrounded the Great House. The Hohokam were master engineers, constructing an irrigation system that sustained agriculture in one of the driest regions of North America. But their knowledge was not recorded. When they left, they took their understanding with them. In the spring of 1988, the U.S. Geological Survey installed a network of seismographs across southern Arizona to monitor tectonic activity along the San Andreas and related fault systems. One of the instruments was placed at Casa Grande ruins, buried 3 feet below the surface, approximately 100 yards north of the main structure. The location was chosen for its stability and proximity to existing National Park Service infrastructure. The seismograph was a standard broadband model capable of detecting ground motion across a wide range of frequencies. It transmitted data continuously to a collection station in Tucson, where it was logged and analyzed along with readings from dozens of other sites across the region. For the first 6 months, the Casa Grande seismograph recorded what was expected: background seismic noise, occasional tremors from distant earthquakes, and the faint vibrations caused by highway traffic on Interstate 10, 5 miles to the north. Then, in October of 1988, a data analyst named Dr. Linda Varga noticed something unusual in the Casa Grande readings. A faint rhythmic pulse appeared in the data, low frequency, barely detectable, but consistent. The pulse occurred every 72 hours, with a precision that suggested a mechanical or electronic source rather than a natural geological process. Varga initially assumed the signal was interference, perhaps from equipment at the monument, or from a nearby agricultural operation. She contacted the Park Service and requested that they check for any machinery or activity that might be generating vibrations. The park superintendent at the time, a man named Gerald Pritchard, conducted a survey. There was no machinery operating near the seismograph, no irrigation pumps, no generators, no construction. The area was quiet. Varga continued monitoring. The pulse appeared again, exactly 72 hours after the previous occurrence, and again 72 hours after that. The timing was precise to within 3 seconds. She expanded her analysis, checking seismographs at other sites in the network. None of them recorded the pulse. It was unique to Casa Grande. In January of 1989, Varga visited the monument with a portable seismometer and a set of acoustic sensors. She placed the equipment at various locations around the ruins, including directly adjacent to the Great House. The pulse was detectable at all locations within the monument boundaries, though it was strongest near the main structure. The frequency measured approximately 17 hertz, below the threshold of normal human hearing, but well within the range detectable by sensitive instruments. Varga's preliminary report, submitted to the USGS in March of 1989, described the pulse as an unidentified low-frequency vibration originating from an unknown subsurface source. She recommended further investigation. The USGS authorized a follow-up study. In June of 1989, a team of geophysicists conducted a series of tests at the monument, including ground-penetrating radar surveys, magnetic field measurements, and additional seismic monitoring. They found no geological anomalies. The bedrock beneath the site was stable with no voids, faults, or unusual formations. The magnetic field was normal. The only anomaly was the pulse itself. One of the team members, Dr. Raymond Kowalczyk, proposed that the vibration might be caused by underground water flow. Natural aquifers can produce rhythmic vibrations as water moves through porous rock. But ground-penetrating radar detected no significant water beneath the site. The region's water table was more than 100 feet below the surface, far too deep to generate the observed signal. Another team member, Dr. Helena Finch, suggested the pulse might be related to the ruins themselves, perhaps a resonance effect caused by the structure's mass interacting with subsurface geology. But resonance requires an external stimulus, and no such stimulus could be identified. The pulse occurred whether there were visitors at the site or not, whether there was wind or calm, whether the temperature was hot or cold. The investigation concluded without a definitive explanation. The final report, dated August 1989, stated, "A low-frequency seismic signal has been consistently observed at Casa Grande Ruins National Monument. The source and voices, mechanism of the signal remain undetermined. The seismograph remained in place, continuing to record data, and the pulse continued uninterrupted every 72 hours. In 1993, a park ranger named Thomas Yellowhorse mentioned the pulse to a colleague, noting that dogs seemed to become restless at predictable intervals. Yellowhorse had worked at the monument for 5 years and had noticed a pattern. Every 3 days, roughly around the same time, dogs visiting the park would become agitated, whining, pacing, pulling on their leashes. Yellowhorse had assumed it was coincidental until he mentioned it to a maintenance worker who kept a dog at the park's administrative office. The worker confirmed that his dog exhibited similar behavior, always at the same intervals. Yellowhorse contacted Dr. Varga, who was still reviewing data from the Casa Grande seismograph. She checked the timing of the pulse against Yellowhorse's observations. The correlation was precise. The dogs became restless within minutes of each pulse occurrence. Varga expanded her inquiry, contacting veterinarians and animal behaviorists to determine whether low-frequency vibrations could affect canine behavior. The consensus was that dogs are sensitive to sounds and vibrations below the human hearing range, and that such stimuli can cause anxiety or discomfort. But the effect is typically immediate. Dogs react when the stimulus is present and calm when it ceases. The restlessness described by Yellowhorse lasted for 10 to 15 minutes, beginning shortly before the pulse and continuing after it ended, as though the animals were anticipating the event. In 1997, a wildlife biologist named Dr. Marcus de Leon conducted a study of animal behavior at the monument. De Leon was interested in how desert species responded to human activity and environmental changes. As part of his research, he placed motion-activated cameras around the site to document wildlife movement. De Leon's data, collected over 6 months, showed an unusual pattern. Coyotes, javelinas, and other wildlife active at night consistently avoided the area around the Great House during the hours when the pulse occurred. The avoidance was not total. Animals still passed through the area, but their activity dropped noticeably during the intervals surrounding each pulse, as though they found the location less hospitable at those times. De Leon shared his findings with the Park Service. He noted that the behavior was subtle and could easily be attributed to other factors, but the timing was consistent enough to warrant attention. In 2004, a journalist writing a feature on unusual scientific phenomena contacted the USGS about the Casa Grande pulse. The resulting article, published in a regional science magazine, was the first public acknowledgement of the anomaly. The article was brief and factual, describing the seismic signal and the lack of explanation. it attracted little attention outside of academic circles. In 2011, the original seismograph was replaced with a newer model as part of a network-wide equipment upgrade. The new instrument was more sensitive and capable of recording a broader range of frequencies. The pulse continued unchanged. The 72-hour interval remained exact. Dr. Varga, who had retired from the USGS in 2009, continued to follow the data. In a conversation with a former colleague in 2013, she noted that the pulse had been recorded for over 25 years without interruption. She remarked that such consistency was unprecedented in her experience. Natural processes, earthquakes, groundwater flow, atmospheric pressure changes are variable. They do not maintain precise intervals over decades. In 2018, a graduate student in geophysics, Lauren Oakes, chose the Casa Grande pulse as the subject of her thesis. She reviewed all available data, conducted new field measurements, and interviewed everyone who had been involved in previous investigations. Her thesis, completed in 2019, provided the most comprehensive analysis of the phenomenon to date. Oakes confirmed that the pulse was real, consistent, and unexplained. She proposed several hypotheses: underground cavities resonating at specific intervals, tidal forces affecting subsurface structures, even human-made sources such as buried infrastructure, but acknowledged that none of the hypotheses fit the available evidence. Oakes's thesis was well received academically, but did not lead to new investigations. Funding for unexplained phenomena is limited, and the Casa Grande pulse, while intriguing, posed no threat and offered no clear research pathway. The seismograph continues to operate. The data continues to be recorded, and every 72 hours, with a precision that machines can measure but no one can explain, the ground beneath Casa Grande ruins vibrates just below the threshold of human awareness. Rangers no longer mention it to visitors. The Park Service does not acknowledge it in official materials. The phenomenon exists in technical reports and academic papers. Accessible to those who look but unknown to most who visit the site. And beneath the ancient walls, something counts, something pulses, something maintains a rhythm that began before anyone was watching and continues undisturbed, as though it has a purpose that time has not yet revealed. Some stones remember how to grow. Petrified Forest National Park stretches across the high desert of northeastern Arizona, covering nearly 230 square miles of badlands, mesas, and fossilized wood that turned to stone over 225 million years ago. The logs lie scattered across the landscape, massive trunks that once towered as living trees in a tropical forest. Now mineralized into quartz and agate, their cellular structure replaced atom by atom with silica over millennia. The park was established in 1962 to protect these remnants from theft and vandalism, though illegal removal of petrified wood remains an ongoing problem. The terrain is harsh and exposed. Summer temperatures exceed 100 degrees. Winter brings freezing winds that scour the painted badlands and exposed fossil beds. Vegetation is sparse, mostly grasses, saltbush, and scattered junipers. The park receives fewer than 700,000 visitors per year, most staying on paved trails and viewing areas. The backcountry is vast and seldom walked, accessible only by permit and offering little shelter from sun or wind. Petrified wood is stone. It does not grow. It does not change, except through erosion or breakage. Its weight should remain constant, barring environmental damage or the slow accumulation of wind-blown sediment. This is basic geology, taught in every university, confirmed by every field study. Stone is inert. In the spring of 1999, park rangers conducting the annual inventory of significant petrified specimens noticed something unusual in the records. The inventory was routine work measuring, photographing, and weighing certain large or scientifically important logs to monitor theft, vandalism, and natural degradation. Each specimen had been cataloged decades earlier, with baseline measurements recorded in the park's database. One of the logs, a 17-foot section of Araucarioxylon arizonicum located in the Blue Mesa area, had gained weight. The difference was small, 0.3 pounds, but measurable. The ranger who noticed the discrepancy, a woman named Sandra Kowalski, assumed it was a recording error. She reweighed the log using a calibrated scale. The measurement was consistent. The log weighed 0.3 pounds more than it had the previous year. Kowalski reported the anomaly to the park's Resource Management Division. A supervisor, Dr. Marcus De Leon, reviewed the records. He found similar discrepancies in the weight measurements of 6 other specimens, all scattered across different areas of the park. Each had gained exactly 0.3 pounds over the previous 12 months. De Leon suspected measurement error or equipment malfunction. He ordered a complete recalibration of all scales used in the inventory and assigned 2 additional rangers to reweigh the specimens independently. The results were identical. The logs had gained weight. In June of 1999, De Leon contacted a geologist at Northern Arizona University, Dr. Helena Yamamoto, who specialized in sedimentary processes and mineral formation. He sent her the inventory data and requested an explanation. Yamamoto reviewed the records and visited the park in July to examine the specimens personally. She found no obvious explanation. The logs showed no signs of new mineral deposits, no cracks or crevices that might have accumulated sediment, and no moisture retention that could account for the additional weight. She took samples from one of the logs, small core drillings that allowed her to analyze the interior structure without causing significant damage. Laboratory analysis showed the wood was fully petrified, with no organic material remaining, and no active chemical processes occurring within the stone. Yamamoto's report, completed in August of 1999, concluded, "The observed weight increase cannot be attributed to known geological or environmental factors. Further monitoring is recommended to determine whether the phenomenon continues." It did. In 2000, the same 7 logs each gained another 0.3 pounds. In 2001, the pattern repeated. By 2005, the cumulative weight increase was consistent across all 7 specimens, 0.3 pounds per year, precise to within 1/10 of an ounce. The park's resource management team expanded the inventory to include all significant petrified logs in the park's collection, over 200 specimens. Only 7 showed the anomalous weight gain. The others remained stable, their weights fluctuating by no more than a few ounces due to normal environmental factors, such as moisture or dust accumulation. The 7 logs shared certain characteristics. All were oriented north-south, with their growth rings aligned along a north-south axis. All were located in open areas with minimal vegetation. All were fragments of the same species, Araucarioxylon arizonicum, a conifer that dominated the ancient forest. But dozens of other logs met the same criteria and showed no weight change. In 2007, a graduate student in geology, Brian Pacheco, chose the phenomenon as the subject of his master's thesis. Pacheco spent 6 months at the park, monitoring the logs and conducting experiments. He placed environmental sensors near each specimen to measure temperature, humidity, wind speed, and solar radiation. He collected soil samples to analyze for mineral content. He even installed motion-activated cameras to document any human interference or animal activity. His thesis, completed in 2008, provided extensive data, but no explanation. The logs continued to gain weight at the same rate, regardless of weather conditions, seasonal changes, or environmental factors. Pacheco wrote, "The weight increase is real, consistent, and inexplicable. The logs are behaving as though they are accumulating mass from a day." Unknown source. One of the park rangers, a man named Victor Ruiz, who had worked at Petrified Forest for over 15 years, mentioned the phenomenon to a Navajo elder during a community outreach event in 2009. The elder listened quietly and said only that some stones carried memory and that certain places in the forest were not meant to be disturbed. He did not elaborate, and when Ruiz asked for more information, the elder declined to speak further. In 2010, the National Park Service authorized a more intensive study. A team from the U.S. Geological Survey visited the park and conducted a comprehensive geophysical survey of the areas surrounding the 7 logs. They used ground-penetrating radar, magnetic field sensors, and gravimetric equipment to search for subsurface anomalies, buried mineral deposits, underground water, or unusual geological structures. They found nothing. The bedrock beneath the logs was consistent with the surrounding area. There were no voids, no faults, no hidden features. The team also analyzed the chemical composition of the logs in greater detail, using X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy to map the distribution of elements within the stone. The results were consistent with typical petrified wood, primarily silicon dioxide, with trace amounts of iron, manganese, and other minerals. There was no evidence of new material being deposited or absorbed. Dr. Raymond Falk, the geologist leading the study, proposed a hypothesis. Perhaps the logs were somehow drawing moisture from the air and converting it into mineral deposits through an unknown process. But laboratory tests showed no increase in moisture content and no chemical reactions occurring within the stone. The hypothesis was abandoned. Falk's final report, submitted in 2011, stated, "The observed weight gain in 7 specimens of petrified wood at Petrified Forest National Park remains unexplained. No geological, chemical, or environmental mechanism has been identified that would account for the phenomenon." In 2012, the Park Service made a controversial decision. One of the 7 logs, a smaller specimen located near the park's northern boundary, would be removed and taken to a laboratory for intensive study. The decision was not made lightly. Removing a petrified log from the park, even for scientific purposes, violated the principles of preservation and non-intervention that guided park management. But the phenomenon had persisted for over a decade, and conventional field studies had yielded no answers. The log was excavated in March of 2012 and transported to a geological research facility in Flagstaff. It was placed in a controlled environment, monitored continuously, and subjected to a battery of tests over the course of 18 months. Researchers measured its weight daily, analyzed its composition monthly, and exposed it to various environmental conditions to determine whether temperature, humidity, or pressure affected the rate of weight gain. The log stopped gaining weight. From the day it was removed from the park, its weight remained stable. No increase was recorded. The phenomenon had ceased. In September of 2013, the log was returned to Petrified Forest and placed back in its original location. Rangers resumed monitoring. The log did not regain weight. It remained inert like any other piece of petrified wood. The other 6 logs, which had remained in place throughout the study, continued to gain 0.3 pounds per year. Dr. Falk, reviewing the data in 2014, wrote in a private memo, "The removal of the specimen appears to have disrupted whatever process was occurring. This suggests the phenomenon is location-dependent, not intrinsic to the logs themselves." But what aspect of the location could cause continuous, measurable mass accumulation in stone? I have no answer. The Park Service quietly ended formal study of the phenomenon in 2015. The logs continue to be monitored as part of the annual inventory, but no new investigations have been authorized. The data is recorded, filed, and archived. No papers have been published. No public announcements have been made. The 6 remaining logs continue to gain weight. The increment is precise, unchanging, and unexplained. Rangers who work in the areas where the logs are located sometimes mention a feeling of unease, though they cannot specify why. The logs look no different than any other petrified wood. They sit on the desert floor, slowly accumulating mass from nowhere, as though remembering something stone should have forgotten millions of years ago. And every year the scales confirm what should not be possible. 0.3 pounds every year, without exception, without explanation. Some voices on the air speak to no one, yet never stop transmitting. Kingman sits in the high desert of northwestern Arizona, a crossroads town where Route 66 once brought travelers through on their way to California. The city lies in the Hualapai Valley, surrounded by the Curbat and Hualapai mountain ranges, at an elevation of 3,400 feet. The landscape is sparse, creosote, Joshua trees, and volcanic rock extending for miles in every direction. The population hovers around 30,000. It is a place defined by passage. Truckers, retirees, and tourists moving through on Interstate 40, which replaced Route 66 in the 1970s and now carries most of the traffic that keeps the town alive. Kingman has a history with radio. During World War II, the Army Air Corps established a gunnery school nearby, training tens of thousands of aerial gunners in the desert air. Communication infrastructure, radio towers, relay stations, emergency frequencies, was built and abandoned as the military scaled down after the war. Some of that infrastructure still stands, rusted and inoperative, scattered across Bureau of Land Management land and private holdings. The area is also popular with amateur radio operators who appreciate the elevation, the clear skies, and the relative lack of electronic interference. In the early morning hours of February 14, 1983, a retired electrical engineer named Lawrence Teague was monitoring shortwave frequencies from his home in Kingman. Teague was an experienced radio operator, licensed since the 1960s, and spent most nights scanning the spectrum for distant broadcasts, weather stations, and the occasional coded transmission left over from Cold War espionage networks. At 6:17 a.m., Teague's receiver locked onto a signal at 9.42 megahertz, a frequency within the shortwave band, but not assigned to any commercial or government broadcaster he recognized. The signal was clear, undistorted, and close. The voice was male, speaking in a flat, emotionless tone, reading a sequence of numbers: 4, 9, 2, 7, 3, 1, 8, 6, 5, 0. The sequence repeated 3 times, each repetition identical in cadence and pitch. Then the transmission ended. Total duration, 90 seconds. Teague recorded the broadcast on a cassette tape and noted the details in his log. He assumed it was a test transmission from a nearby amateur operator or perhaps a remnant signal from an old military frequency. He did not think much of it until the following year. On February 14, 1984, at 6:17 a.m., the transmission occurred again. Same frequency, same voice, same sequence of numbers. Teague was listening that morning, expecting nothing in particular, and was startled when the broadcast began. He recorded it. The voice was identical to the previous year, not just similar, but identical, as though the same recording had been played, twice 12 months apart. Teague began monitoring the frequency every February 14th. The transmission appeared in 1985, 1986, and every year thereafter. The timing never varied by more than a few seconds. The sequence never changed. The voice never deviated. By 1990, Teague had shared the phenomenon with other members of the Mojave Amateur Radio Club, a group of approximately 20 operators who met monthly to discuss equipment, techniques, and unusual broadcasts. Several members began monitoring the frequency as well. All of them heard the transmission on February 14, 1991. All recorded it. All confirmed the details matched Teague's earlier logs. One of the club members, a retired Air Force radio technician named Dorothy Gilstrap, recognized the format. She said it resembled a numbers station, a type of shortwave broadcast used during the Cold War to send encrypted messages to intelligence operatives in the field. Numbers stations typically consisted of a voice reading sequences of digits, often preceded by a musical tone or identifier. The messages were encoded, intended for a single recipient who possessed the key to decode them. Most numbers stations ceased operation after the Cold War ended, though a few are still active, their purposes unknown. But the Kingman transmission did not match the typical characteristics of a numbers station. It was too short, only 90 seconds. It occurred only once per year, and it used a frequency not commonly associated with intelligence broadcasts. In 1992, the Radio Club decided to attempt triangulation. On February 14th, 3 members positioned themselves at different locations around Kingman. One to the north, near the base of the Surbit Mountains. One to the south, along Highway 93. And one to the east, near the old gunnery school site. Each carried a directional antenna capable of determining the approximate bearing of a radio signal. At 6:17 a.m., the transmission began. All 3 operators received it, but their directional antennas provided conflicting results. The operator to the north determined the signal was coming from the southeast. The operator to the south placed it to the northwest. The operator to the east could not determine a direction at all. The signal appeared to be coming from all directions simultaneously, as though the source were directly overhead or impossibly diffuse. Triangulation failed. The operators could not agree on a location. The signal was strong, local, but untraceable. In 1994, a member of the club contacted the Federal Communications Commission, reporting the transmission as an unauthorized broadcast. The FCC opened an investigation. An agent visited Kingman in March of 1994 and interviewed several club members. The agent listened to Teague's recordings and reviewed the logs. He said the FCC would monitor the frequency and attempt to locate the source. On February 14, 1995, FCC monitoring stations in Arizona and Nevada recorded the transmission. The signal was detected at facilities in Kingman, Las Vegas, and Needles, California, suggesting a broadcast range of at least 150 miles. But when FCC agents attempted direction finding, they encountered the same problem the amateur operators had experienced. The signal's origin could not be pinpointed. It seemed to emanate from multiple locations at once, or from no fixed location at all. The FCC investigation was closed in June of 1995. The final report, obtained years later through a Freedom of Information Act request, stated, "An unidentified shortwave transmission occurs annually on February 14th at approximately 06:15 hours local time. The signal originates within the southwestern United States, but cannot be localized using standard direction-finding techniques. The content consists of a numerical sequence with no identifiable meaning. No violation of communications law has been confirmed." The transmission continued. Every February 14th, every year, 6:17 a.m. local time, 9.42 megahertz, 90 seconds. 10 numbers repeated 3 times. In 2001, a linguistics professor at Northern Arizona University, Dr. Helena Varga, analyzed the number sequence at the request of a Kingman resident who had read about the phenomenon in a local newspaper. Varga examined the sequence for patterns, mathematical progressions, alphabetic codes, cipher systems. She found nothing. The numbers appeared random, with no discernible structure or meaning. In 2006, a journalist from Phoenix, a man named Victor Kowalski, visited Kingman and wrote an article about the transmission for a regional magazine. The article attracted some attention. Kowalski interviewed Teague, now in his 80s, and several other radio operators. He also contacted retired intelligence officers asking if they recognized the transmission format. None did. One former NSA analyst told Kowalski that the transmission looked like a number station but doesn't act like one. He declined to elaborate. In 2009, a group of engineers from a tech company in California visited Kingman with advanced signal analysis equipment, hoping to solve the mystery as a weekend project. They set up receivers at multiple locations and recorded the transmission on February 14, 2010. Their equipment confirmed what earlier attempts had shown. The signal appeared to come from within 50 miles of Kingman, but could not be traced to a specific point. The engineers proposed that the transmission might be using a technique called skywave propagation, bouncing off the ionosphere in a way that obscured its origin. But skywave propagation is inconsistent, affected by atmospheric conditions and time of day. The Kingman transmission was perfectly consistent year after year under all weather conditions. The engineers left without an answer. In 2015, the transmission was live-streamed by a radio enthusiast who had set up an automated receiver tuned to 9.42 megahertz. The live stream was uploaded to a website dedicated to shortwave oddities. Listeners from around the world tuned in on February 14, 2016. The transmission occurred as expected. Comments on the live stream ranged from technical analysis to speculation about espionage, forgotten experiments, and automated systems running long after their operators had died. No one had a definitive explanation. Lawrence Teague passed away in 2017. He had documented the transmission for 34 years, never missing a February 14th broadcast. His logs, tapes, and notes were donated to the Mojave Museum of History and Arts in Kingman, where they remain on file, available to researchers but rarely accessed. The transmission continues. On February 14, 2024, it was recorded by at least a dozen operators, both in Kingman and across the southwestern United States. The sequence remains the same. The voice remains unchanged. The signal remains strong and untraceable. Amateur radio operators who monitor the frequency have developed a quiet tradition. They listen each year, record the broadcast, and share their logs online. No one expects an explanation anymore. The transmission has become part of the background, an annual ritual, a mystery that persists not because it is hidden, but because it cannot be solved. Some operators have speculated that the transmission is automated, originating from a transmitter hidden somewhere in the desert, powered by solar panels or a long-lasting battery, programmed decades ago and forgotten. But such a system would require maintenance. Batteries degrade, electronics fail, solar panels accumulate dust, and the signal would weaken over time. The Kingman frequency has not weakened. It remains as strong now as it was in 1983. Others suggest the transmission is a hoax, maintained by someone with access to radio equipment and a taste for mystery. But the consistency, 41 years without deviation, argues against a hoax. Hoaxes end. People lose interest. Equipment breaks. Life intervenes. The Kingman frequency has never stopped. And so it continues. Every February 14th at dawn, broadcasting numbers to no one or to someone who has been listening all along but has never replied. Some warnings are buried too deep to be accidents. Yuma sits in the southwestern corner of Arizona, where the Colorado River bends through the Sonoran Desert before continuing into Mexico. The city has existed as a crossing point for centuries, first for indigenous peoples, then for Spanish explorers, then for American settlers heading west during the gold rush. By the late 19th century, Yuma was a territorial prison town, known for brutal summers when temperatures exceeded 120 degrees. The prison closed in 1909. The town grew slowly, sustained by agriculture, military installations, and its position along Interstate 8. East of the city, the land flattens into agricultural zones, vast fields irrigated by canals that draw water from the Colorado River. The soil is fertile when watered, barren when dry. For decades, the area remained farmland, punctuated by scattered homesteads and the occasional dirt road. But by the early 2000s, Yuma's population was expanding. Developers began purchasing agricultural parcels, planning subdivisions and commercial centers to accommodate growth. In March of 2012, a construction company called Desert Ridge Development broke ground on a mixed-use project, residential homes, a shopping center, and a medical complex on a 140-acre site approximately 8 miles east of downtown Yuma. The land had been farmland until 2009, when it was sold to a development consortium. Preliminary surveys had been conducted. Environmental assessments were completed. Permits were issued. Nothing in the records suggested any complications. On March 7, 2012, an excavation crew was digging foundation trenches for a drainage system when a bulldozer operator named Thomas Reyes struck something solid 11 feet below the surface. Reyes stopped the machine and called the site supervisor, a man named Gerald Kowalski. Kowalski inspected the obstruction and initially assumed it was bedrock or a buried boulder. But when the soil was cleared away, they found a concrete marker, a rectangular block approximately 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, and 8 inches thick, embedded horizontally in undisturbed earth. The marker was stamped with text, cleanly engraved as though by industrial equipment. The text read 32DG39 or 14, N 114D 33 sur 8 W. September 19, 1956. Do not excavate beyond this depth. Kowalski photographed the marker and reported it to the project manager, who contacted the development company's legal team. The coordinates were immediately recognizable as longitude and latitude. When plotted on a map, they indicated a location 300 yards to the northeast, still within the development site, but in an area not yet disturbed by construction. The date, September 19, 1956, predated any known development in the area. In 1956, the land had been agricultural, owned by a farming family. That had sold it in the 1970s. No construction records from that period mentioned the installation of any markers or subsurface infrastructure. The phrase, "do not excavate beyond this depth," was unambiguous. But there was no indication of who had placed the marker, why it had been buried 11 feet underground, or what lay at the coordinates it referenced. Kowalski contacted Yuma County's Planning and Zoning Office, requesting records of any permits or surveys from 1956 that might explain the marker. The county had no records. He contacted the Bureau of Land Management, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the U.S. Geological Survey. None had documentation of any subsurface markers or warnings in that area. A retired civil engineer named Dorothy Schaefer, who had worked in Yuma since the 1960s, was consulted. She reviewed photographs of the marker and stated that the engraving style and concrete composition were consistent with mid-20th century industrial standards, likely military or government work. She noted that the depth of burial, 11 feet, was unusual. Markers intended for future reference are typically placed near the surface. Markers buried that deep are meant to be forgotten or to remain hidden until accidentally discovered. In April of 2012, the development company hired a geotechnical surveying firm to conduct ground-penetrating radar scans of the area indicated by the coordinates. The firm, Southwest Geophysical Services, deployed a team with GPR equipment and spent 2 days scanning a grid centered on the specified location. The results were anomalous. At a depth of approximately 35 feet, the radar detected a void, a hollow space with no visible support structures, no tunnels leading to it, and no geological explanation. The void was spherical, measuring roughly 40 feet in diameter. The surrounding soil and rock showed no signs of collapse, subsidence, or disturbance. It was as though the void had been intentionally created, then sealed. The survey team's report, completed in May of 2012, included the GPR data and a note from the lead surveyor, a man named Victor De Leon. De Leon wrote, "The void's geometry is inconsistent with natural cave formation. The spherical shape and uniform dimensions suggest artificial construction. However, no entry points or structural elements are visible in the radar data. If this void was created intentionally, the method of construction is unclear." The development company submitted the findings to Yuma County and requested guidance on how to proceed. County officials consulted with state agencies. In June of 2012, a representative from the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality visited the site and reviewed the data. The representative noted that if the void contained hazardous materials, contamination, or unexploded ordnance, excavation could pose a risk. She recommended that the area be cordoned off pending further investigation. In July of 2012, the development company contacted the U.S. Army's Yuma Proving Ground, a military installation located 30 miles northeast of the site. The Yuma Proving Ground has been used for weapons testing since 1943, and there was speculation that the void might be related to Cold War-era experiments or munitions storage. A representative from the Proving Ground reviewed the survey data and stated that the site was outside the installation's historical operational boundaries. The Army had no records of activity in that area. By August of 2012, the development project was stalled. The marker and the void had become legal and safety liabilities. The development company retained an environmental law firm to determine whether they were required to investigate further or whether they could simply avoid the area. The law firm's opinion was that without evidence of contamination or hazardous materials, the company was not legally obligated to excavate or investigate the void. However, the marker's warning suggested that someone, at some point, had considered excavation dangerous. In September of 2012, the development plans were revised. The area containing the void was designated as open space and incorporated into the project as a landscape park. No construction would occur within a 500-foot radius of the coordinates specified on the marker. The revised plans were approved by the county in October. Construction resumed on the remaining portions of the site. The concrete marker was removed and placed in storage at the development company's headquarters. Photographs and documentation were archived. The surveying firm's report was filed, but not made public. In 2014, a local historian named Raymond Ortega, researching Cold War-era activity in Yuma County, came across a brief mention of the marker in a county planning document. He contacted the development company and requested access to the photographs and survey data. The company declined, citing proprietary concerns and ongoing legal sensitivities. Ortega filed a public records request with Yuma County. The request was partially fulfilled. He received copies of the planning documents and a single photograph of the marker, but the geophysical survey data was withheld, classified as confidential business information. Ortega published a short article in a regional history journal in 2015 describing the marker and speculating about its origins. He noted that September 19, 1956, fell during a period of intense nuclear testing in Nevada and significant military activity across the southwestern United States. He suggested the void might be related to Cold War infrastructure, perhaps a storage facility, a monitoring station, or an experimental site. But he acknowledged that without access to the survey, data, or historical military records, any explanation was speculative. In 2017, a graduate student in archaeology, Lauren Furtado, read Ortega's article and decided to investigate further. She contacted the Yuma Proving Ground, the National Archives, and the Department of Energy, requesting records of any projects or activities in the area in 1956. The Yuma Proving Ground responded that they had no relevant records. The National Archives provided general documents about military land use in Arizona, but nothing specific to the site. The Department of Energy declined to respond. Furtado visited the development site in March of 2018. The area designated as open space was now a landscaped park with walking paths, benches, and sparse vegetation. There were no signs, no markers, no indication that anything unusual lay beneath the surface. She walked the area with a handheld GPS unit, locating the coordinates specified on the buried marker. The point was unremarkable, a patch of desert grass and gravel indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape. Furtado's thesis, completed in 2019, included a chapter on the Yuma marker. She concluded that the marker and the void represented an unresolved historical mystery, likely connected to mid-20th century military or government activity. She recommended further archival research and, if possible, direct investigation of the void using modern excavation techniques. Her thesis was reviewed favorably but did not lead to new investigations. The park remains open to the public. Residents of the surrounding subdivision use it for walking and recreation. Few are aware of what lies beneath. In 2022, a journalist from Phoenix visited the site and interviewed several residents. Most had never heard of the marker or the void. One resident, a retired engineer who had purchased a home in the development in 2013, said he had heard rumors but dismissed them as urban legends. When shown the photograph of the marker, he said it looked authentic but declined to speculate about its purpose. The development company that discovered the marker was acquired by a larger corporation in 2020. The archived materials, photographs, survey data, the marker itself, were transferred to the new owner. Requests for access have been declined. The void remains undisturbed. 35 feet below a public park, a perfect sphere of empty space waits in silence, its purpose unknown, its contents unexamined. And 300 yards away, buried 11 feet in earth that has not been touched since 1956, a concrete marker warns against digging deeper. No one has. No,